The fog rises from the Thames like a living entity tasting of coal dust and horse manure in the bruised Victorian twilight. The clatter of hooves on slick cobblestone echoes through the narrow, choked streets of Whitechapel. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I am glad you are here. If stepping into these forgotten worlds helps you find rest, consider subscribing to return whenever the present becomes too loud. You push through the dense crowd on Whitechapel Road, your eyes watering from the thick, sulphurous fog that settles heavily over the district. The air carries a palpable texture, coating your throat with every breath and stinging any exposed skin with a harsh, acidic bite. Vendors shout their prices over the relentless rattle of wooden carts, their voices forming a chaotic chorus of commerce and pure survival. You keep your hand pressed firmly against your pocket, feeling the cold weight of the 4 copper coins that represent your entire fortune for the day. The bruised orange light of dusk begins to fade into a deeper, more permanent gray. Smoke from countless chimneys presses downward against the rooftops, trapping the stench of the industrial age in the narrow thoroughfare. Shadows stretch and distort across the slick cobblestones as the gas lamps flicker to life one by one along the main road. The lamplighter moves methodically down the street, his long pole igniting small, isolated islands of visibility in the gathering dark. Each pool of light feels incredibly fragile, barely holding back the immense weight of the smoke-filled night that presses against it from all sides. A distant hammer rings out from a closed workshop, a sharp metallic sound that cuts cleanly through the muffled roar of the East End. The cold begins to seep through the thin wool of your coat, carrying the damp, brackish chill of the nearby river. Soot falls like black snow, settling on the shoulders of hurried pedestrians and turning the wet streets into a slippery hazard. You pull your collar up against the wind, heading toward a narrow side alley where the suffocating press of humanity thins slightly. The smell of rancid cooking oil and unwashed bodies hangs heavily between the brick walls, mixing with the ever-present stench of burning coal. You scan the dilapidated doorways for the familiar sign of a DOS house seeking a refuge that asks no questions and demands only your meager copper coins. Footsteps echo on the pavement somewhere behind you, prompting a spike of adrenaline and a deliberate quickening of your pace. The reality of these streets demands constant vigilance, turning every darkened corner into a potential threat. You clutch your meager belongings tighter to your chest, carefully avoiding the deepest recesses where the gaslight fails to reach. The wooden sign above the lodging house hangs crookedly on rusted iron hinges, groaning softly in the evening breeze. Inside the cramped entryway, the keeper sits behind a battered wooden desk, her face worn smooth by years of witnessing the endless procession of transient despair. Smoke from her clay pipe curls toward the moisture-stained ceiling, adding another layer to the room's stifling atmosphere. She takes your 4 pence without a single word, sliding a small, greasy ticket across the scratched wood of the counter. The transaction is brutally simple, an exchange of bare survival for the coins you labored all day to secure. She gestures vaguely toward a dark stairwell, her attention already shifting back to the ledger open in front of her. You climb the narrow, creaking staircase, the worn wood groaning in protest under your careful weight. The corridor above smells strongly of carbolic soap and human sweat, a potent reminder of the dozens of men packed into these small rooms. You locate your assigned bed in the chamber shared with 8 others, the iron frame rusted and the mattress lumpy with the memories of countless previous occupants. A man in the far corner hacks with a harsh, rattling cadence his lungs, fighting a losing battle against the city's toxic air. You set your small bundle on the uneven floorboards and sit on the edge of the mattress, the metal springs squealing in sharp protest. The walls are thin enough that the breathing of the men in the adjacent room bleeds through the plaster. Outside the single, grime-caked window, the sounds of Whitechapel continue their relentless, unforgiving rhythm. 2 men argue loudly in the street below, their voices harsh and jagged in the damp night air. A draft horse whinnies from a nearby stable, the sound carrying a note of unexpected wildness in the urban crush. The fog presses against the glass, mirroring the light from the street lamps into hazy, formless blobs of pale yellow. The cold drab slipping through the poorly fitted window frame carries the distinct metallic scent of blood. From the butcher's yard a block away, you pull your knees up slightly, trying to preserve whatever body heat you have managed to retain from the walk. You lie back against the rough fabric of the sheets, feeling the residual warmth left by the man who occupied this space just an hour ago. The pillow smells faintly of old hair oil, and stale tobacco, a lingering ghost of someone else's difficult life. You close your eyes, but rest remains distant, held at bay by the chorus of snoring, coughing, and restless movement from the men around you. The relentless damp of the mattress seeps into your bones, bringing an ache to your joints that feels familiar and permanent. You focus on the steady rhythm of your own breathing, trying to tune out the overwhelming presence of the crowded city. The ceiling above you vanishes into the gloom, a dark canopy over a temporary sanctuary. Hours stretch into a strange, suspended state between wakefulness and uneasy rest. As the building settles into the night, the room grows colder as the darkness deepens. The meager heat from the sleeping bodies unable to counteract a pervasive chill. Vermin rustle softly in the wainscoting, their tiny claws scratching against the dry, rotting wood in search of discarded crumbs. The distant chime of a church clock marks the passage of time, striking two heavy notes that reverberate through the quieted streets. The darkness inside the room feels vast and unbroken, broken only by the faint, sickly glow filtering through the dirty glass. The snoring of the man in the adjacent bed shifts into a low, rattling wheeze. You shift onto your side, pulling the thin, scratchy blanket tighter around your shoulders in a futile attempt to capture warmth. The coarse wool offers little physical comfort, functioning more as a psychological barrier against the freezing draft. You think about the call on at the docks tomorrow morning, the desperate crush of men vying for a few hours of backbreaking labor. The memory of heavy grain sacks tearing at your muscles mingles with the sharp, hollow ache in your empty stomach. You force your mind away from the hunger, knowing that dwelling on it will only make the remaining hours of the night unbearable. You listen to the rain begin to patter against the window pane, a light drizzle that will turn the morning streets into a treacherous slick of mud. Dawn approaches not with light, but with the gradual shifting of the shadows from black to a bruised, sullen gray. The fog has thickened overnight, settling over the East End like a suffocating blanket of wet soot. The first sounds of the waking city begin to rise, the rattle of a milk cart over the cobbles, and the harsh cry of a street sweeper beginning his route. The man in the corner resumes his harsh coughing fit, the sound echoing painfully in the confined space. The brief respite of the night is officially over, replaced by the immediate, crushing demands of another day. The light creeping through the window reveals the full extent of the room's grime, illuminating dust motes dancing in the cold air. You rise from the bed, your body stiff and protesting every minor movement. The cold air bites at your skin as you pull on your boots, the worn leather stiff and unyielding against your calloused heels. You join the silent shuffle of men heading down the stairs, each lost in their own internal calculus of survival and debt. The keeper ignores you entirely as you step out into the street, her attention already focused on a new customer seeking shelter. The morning air hits your lungs like inhaled ash, triggering a deep, rough cough that leaves your throat raw and aching. The dampness penetrates your coat, instantly chilling you before you have even walked a dozen paces. The streets are already crowded with laborers hurrying toward the docks and factories, heads bowed against the morning chill. A coffee vendor shouts his wares from the corner, steam rising from his battered metal urn in a thick, inviting cloud. The smell of the hot, bitter liquid mixes with the scent of roasted chestnuts from a neighboring wooden cart. Coins clink softly as men exchange their meager copper for a momentary warmth before facing the physical toll of their assigned work. The fog diffuses the morning light, making the entire city look like a faded sepia-toned photograph left out in the rain. Carts rumble past their iron-rimmed wheels, striking sparks off the uneven cobblestones. You spend one of your remaining coins on a cup of the dark, gritty coffee, wrapping your cold hands around the tin mug. The liquid burns your tongue, tasting faintly of burnt toast and chicory, but the heat is a welcome shock to your system. You walk as you drink, joining the steady stream of men flowing toward the riverfront and the promise of wages. The massive brick walls of the warehouses rise up before you, solid and unyielding against the shifting, pale mist. You take your place in the growing crowd at the dock gates, steeling yourself for the brutal competition of the morning call-on. The air here smells heavily of the Thames, a briny, sewage-tainted odor that clings to the back of your throat. The foreman steps out onto the raised wooden platform, a thick ledger under his arm and a look of practiced indifference carved into his face. Hundreds of men surge forward, waving their hands and shouting to be noticed. A desperate wave of humanity breaking against the authority of the man with the ledger. The selection process is quick and ruthless. Based on perceived strength, familiarity, and unpredictable whim, those chosen are ushered quickly through the iron gates, their faces grim with the prospect of the heavy labor ahead. Those left behind slowly disperse, their shoulders slumped in defeat, forced to search elsewhere for the means to survive the day. The lucky few line up to receive their brass tallies, the small tokens that guarantee they will eat tonight. You catch the foreman's eye and hold his gaze, trying to project a strength and endurance you do not currently feel. He points a thick, scarred finger in your direction, and a surge of relief washes over you, quickly followed by the dread of the work to come. You move through the heavy iron gates, the smell of the river and the damp cargo hitting you with renewed intensity. The foreman directs your group toward a massive ship unloading timber from Scandinavia. The rough-hewn logs piled precariously on the wet deck. You take your position at the bottom of the gangplank, bracing your legs for the crushing weight of the first load. The wood is slick with rain, making every step a calculated risk. The rough bark bites through your thin canvas gloves as you hoist the first massive log onto your shoulder. Muscles strain immediately against the dead weight. Burning in protest at the sudden harsh effort, you grind your teeth together and force your legs to propel you up the steep, swaying gangplank. The river wind whips across the open deck, slicing through your damp coat with icy precision. Other men move in a synchronized rhythm of misery all around you, forming a human conveyor belt of desperate labor. This is the brutal mathematics of the docks, where bone and sinew are traded directly for copper. You adjust your grip, feeling a jagged splinter drive deep into the fleshy part of your palm. Stopping to pull it out is not an option. When the foreman stands watching from his raised wooden platform, blood mixes with the rain and river grime, creating a dark paste against your chilled skin. The air grows thicker with the smell of wet wool and the sharp, resinous tang of the imported pine. Every trip down to the waiting carts adds another layer of leaden fatigue to your limbs. The Norwegian sailors above shout down directions in a harsh, guttural language you cannot understand. You watch the pale gray sky offer no warmth, only a shifting canopy of industrial soot. The great iron cranes swing overhead like predatory birds, their chains rattling a harsh industrial warning. Whistles blare from passing steamships, momentarily drowning out the shouts of the stevedores and the thud of dropping timber. The rain ceases briefly, leaving behind a penetrating dampness that clings to everything it touches. Mud swallows your boots with each heavy step, threatening to pull you down into the muck. A slip here could mean a shattered ankle, or worse, beneath the rolling logs. Survival demands absolute focus on the few feet of treacherous ground immediately ahead. You hear the sharp clang of the midday bell ring out across the wharves. The relentless human machinery halts almost instantly, men dropping their loads with exhausted sighs. You find an overturned crate near a brick warehouse wall and collapse onto the splintered wood. Reaching into your pocket, you pull out a hard piece of rye bread saved from yesterday's meager rations. The crust is stale and requires dedicated chewing, but the carbohydrates offer a faint promise of renewed energy. The Thames churns darkly against the wooden pilings, carrying the refuse of millions toward the sea. An older docker sits beside you, his face weathered into a map of deep creases and accumulated dirt. He offers no greeting, simply unrolling the small cloth containing a wedge of hard cheese and half an onion. The silence between you is the hushed camaraderie of shared suffering, requiring no useless pleasantries. He pulls a dull knife from his belt and cuts the onion, the sharp scent cutting through the pervasive smell of raw sewage. You watch a rat scurry along the edge of the wharf, boldly inspecting a discarded piece of rope. Life here is tough, resilient, and constantly searching for the next small meal. You force yourself back to your feet before your muscles have a chance to stiffen fully in the cold. The bell rings again, signaling the end of the brief reprieve and demanding your return to the timber pile. The logs seem to have doubled in weight during the rest period, pressing down with malicious intent. Your breath forms ragged white clouds in the freezing air, matching the rhythm of your heavy footfalls. You just follow the physical cues, grabbing the heavy ropes and hauling the lumber into position on the muddy ground. The work strips away everything except the immediate need to lift, carry, and survive. You feel the shadows begin to lengthen across the dockyard as the afternoon stretches into a grueling marathon of endurance. Shouts ring out as a heavy chain snaps on a nearby lighter, sending a load of coal crashing into the murky water. A narrow escape for the men working below is met only with curses and immediate orders to resume loading. There is no time to ponder near misses when strict schedules dictate the movement of empire. The machinery of commerce grinds forward, fueled by the disposable bodies of the desperate. The wind picks up again, carrying the faint, metallic scent of an impending storm. You ignore the burning sensation radiating down your spine and focus solely on the rhythm of the crew. Hands blister, tear, and callous over the span of a few hours, adapting to the harsh friction of wet bark. The foreman paces the line, his heavy boots splashing through the filthy puddles, yelling at anyone whose pace falters. You keep your head down and your shoulders squared, determined not to give him a reason to dock your pay. The coppers waiting at the end of this torment are the only things keeping you upright. The physical toll is merely a debt you will pay later tonight. In the dark, cold room, you hear the final whistle blow, just as the bruised sky begins to darken into a true, deep twilight. You drop the last log onto the stack, your arms trembling uncontrollably from the sustained exertion. The queue for payment forms quickly, a jagged line of battered men waiting outside the brick office. Gas lamps flare to life around the perimeter of the yard, casting harsh yellow light over the exhausted faces. The clerk behind the window counts out the coins with agonizing precision, dropping them into calloused, outstretched hands. 3 shillings and 4 pence clink into your palm, the tangible reward for 10 hours of destroying your body. You close your fist tight around the metal, feeling the cold edges press into your torn skin. You merge with the tide of laborers flowing out through the main iron gates and back into the labyrinth of streets. The transition from the structured brutality of the docks to the chaotic peril of Whitechapel requires an immediate shift in awareness. You slip the coins deep into an inside pocket, keeping one hand pressed against the fabrics, a guard against pickpockets. The fog is returning, creeping up from the riverbanks to swallow the brickwork and obscure the gaslights. You walk with a measured stride, masking the severe limp threatening to take over your left leg. Weakness is a massive liability in these alleys, an open invitation to those who prey on the exhausted. The street hawkers are out in full force as the evening descends, their voices forming a cacophonous wall of sound. Carts piled high with wilted cabbages and bruised apples line the edge of the thoroughfare, illuminated by the sputtering glare of naphtha flares. The intense chemical light casts harsh, erratic shadows across the faces of the women haggling over pennies. You pass a cellar offering hot meat pies, the rich, savory smell momentarily overpowering the ambient stench of the gutters. Your stomach clenches, demanding immediate attention after a day fueled by nothing but stale crusts. Hunger wins the brief internal debate, and you exchange a copper coin for a small, steaming pastry wrapped in greased paper. You eat the pie standing in the shadow of a brick archway, savoring the salty, peppery warmth. The meat is of indeterminate origin, heavily spiced to mask any hint of spoilage, but it fills the hollow ache in your gut. You chew, deliberately extracting every possible ounce of energy from the meager meal. A stray dog watches you from a safe distance, its ribs showing clearly against its matted coat, hoping for a dropped crumb. You break off a small piece of the thick crust and toss it onto the cobbles, watching the animal snatch it up and vanish into the gloom. Even in this destitute corner of the empire, there is always something hungrier than you are. The transition from late afternoon to evening brings a subtle shift in the composition of the crowds. The honest laborers heading home are gradually replaced by the nocturnal denizens of the East End. Women with painted faces step out from the shadows of doorways, their eyes sharp and calculating. Groups of young men loiter on the corners, their caps pulled low, watching the flow of foot traffic with predatory intent. The air grows colder, biting through your damp clothing and making your muscles seize. The brick facades of the tenements rise up on either side of the narrow lane, blocking out the last remaining traces of the sky. You navigate the twisting alleys with practiced caution, avoiding the darkest stretches where the gaslights have failed or been deliberately smashed. The familiar groan of a tavern sign swinging in the wind signals your approach to a cluster of lodging houses. A loud crash of breaking glass erupts from the pub's front door, followed by 2 men tumbling out into the muddy street. You step wide to avoid the brawl, keeping your head down and your pace even. Survival here means never stopping to watch someone else's misfortune. Unless it directly threatens your own trajectory, You push open the heavy oak door of a lodging house on Dorset Street, seeking refuge from the escalating chaos outside. The heat of the common kitchen hits you immediately. A suffocating blast of coal smoke, boiling cabbage, and wet wool. Dozens of men and women crowd around the large central hearth, fighting for space to dry their clothes or heat their meager rations. The noise is deafening, a roar of overlapping arguments, hacking coughs, and the clatter of tin plates. You spot the deputy keeper sitting behind a wire cage in the corner, a ledger open before him. The transaction is swift and impersonal, a trade of 4 pence for a wooden tally indicating your assigned bed number. You climb the wooden stairs, the air growing staler and colder with each floor you ascend. The dormitory is vast and low-ceilinged, containing at least 50 iron beds packed so closely together that you must squeeze sideways between them. The smell here is dense, a layered history of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of cheap gin. You find your numbered bed near the center of the room, a precarious position surrounded on all sides by unpredictable strangers. The mattress is stuffed with flock, lumpy and unyielding, covered by a single coarse blanket. You sit down heavily, the iron frame protesting with a sharp squeak that is instantly lost in the ambient noise. The room is already half full of men seeking early shelter from the biting cold. Some are men in torn clothing with crude, clumsy stitches, squinting in the faint light provided by a single gas jet near the door. Others sit staring blankly at the floor, their faces slack with the unique exhaustion that comes from chronic malnutrition and relentless labor. A man a few beds over pulls a small battered bottle from his coat, taking a long pull of whatever cheap spirit he has managed to secure. The liquid offers a temporary chemical warmth, a brief illusion of comfort in a harshly uncomfortable world. You untie your boots with stiff, aching fingers, wincing as the swollen joints protest the movement. You inspect the soles of your boots, noting a new crack in the leather that will let the freezing rain seep through tomorrow. Replacing them is impossible on a docker's wage, requiring weeks of saving that you can never manage. You stuff the toes with crumpled newspaper, retrieved from the street, a desperate measure to provide a fraction more insulation. Tucking your boots securely under the mattress ensures they will not vanish during the night. The small precautions of poverty become firmly ingrained habits, performed automatically without conscious thought. The gas jet is suddenly turned down by the deputy on his rounds, throwing the vast room into deep shadow. The reduction in light triggers a settling among the men, a collective shifting as bodies seek the least painful positions on the hard mattresses. Outside the grimy window, the relentless noise of Whitechapel continues unabated, a steady roar of human suffering and endurance. A horse-drawn omnibus clatters past on the main road, the heavy vibrations traveling up through the brickwork to rattle the floorboards. The sounds of the city are a constant companion, a reminder that the machinery of London never truly stops, even when its parts break down. You lie back, resting your head on your bundled coat, staring up at the water-stained plaster of the ceiling. You listen to the varied rhythms of breathing around you, attempting to identify the distinct individuals solely by their respiratory struggles. The man to your left has a wet, bubbling cough that speaks of fluid pooling deep in his lungs. To your right, a younger man breathes with a sharp, panicked wheeze, likely the result of inhaling factory dust for 14 hours a day. The air in the room is stagnant, offering no fresh oxygen, only a recycled mixture of everyone else's exhalations. You pull the rough blanket up to your chin, finding it carries a faint, sour odor of old sickness. It is the scent of destitution, an aroma you have come to accept as the natural perfume of the East End. The thought of the upcoming winter begins to creep into the edge of your mind, a cold dread that sits heavy in your chest. When the temperature drops below freezing, these walls will offer little more than a windbreak against the lethal chill. Coal will become prohibitively expensive, leading to a desperate scramble for any combustible scrap of wood or paper. You have seen men freeze to death in alleyways, their bodies stiff and blue beneath layers of useless rags. The margin of error in this life is razor thin, leaving no room for illness, injury, or severe weather. You force the thoughts away, knowing that anticipating future misery only ruins the small comforts of the present. You rub the hardened calluses on your palms, feeling grit of the river docks permanently embedded in your skin. The physical changes wrought by the labor are undeniable, your body adapting to the brutal demands placed upon it. Shoulders broaden and hunch forward, shaped by the constant bearing of heavy loads. Hands become rough, desensitized tools incapable of feeling fine textures. You are being gradually remade by the city, forged into a specialized instrument of commerce. The realization brings a faint pang of sorrow, quickly buried beneath the absolute necessity of survival. The noise from the street below occasionally pierces the muffled atmosphere of the dormitory, a sharp scream or the shattering of glass breaking the monotony. No one in the room reacts to the disturbances. Curiosity is a dangerous luxury when violence is commonplace. The only true safety lies in anonymity, in blending seamlessly into the vast, suffering background of the slum. You close your eyes, not to surrender to the void, but merely to rest your stinging vision against the darkness. The ache in your bones settles into a dull, persistent throb, a rhythmic reminder of the day's physical toll. The night stretches out ahead, a dark span of hours that must be endured before the brutal cycle begins again. The walls of the lodging house stand firm against the creeping fog, holding the desperate humanity within. You remain sharply aware of your surroundings, listening to the creak of the floorboards as a restless man paces the aisle. True rest is an illusion here. You must remain vigilant, guarding your meager possessions even in the pitch black. The city outside continues its relentless, grinding rotation. You lie rigid and motionless upon the lumpy flock, mattress tracking the progress of the cold as it seeps through the thin walls. The draft from the poorly fitted window carries the harsh metallic tang of the nearby abattoir, mixed with the pervasive coal soot. A man 3 beds over mutters something incomprehensible, his voice cracking with the strain of a vivid terror. The iron frame beneath you conducts the chill directly into your spine, a relentless reminder of the building's decaying infrastructure. You keep your hands curled into tight fists inside your pockets, preserving whatever residual heat your body can generate. The darkness presses against your wide-open eyes with a physical weight, obscuring the ceiling and the peeling wallpaper. Waiting for morning requires a specialized kind of endurance, a mental fortitude that accepts the suffering without looking for immediate escape. You shift your weight, slightly confirming the grim reality of the infested bedding. The bedbugs wait for the cessation of movement to extract their tiny blood dividend from the exhausted lodgers. You pinch the rough wool blanket between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the damp residue of sweat left by the men who occupied this space hours before you. The itch flares along your shoulder blades, sharp and persistent, demanding an attention you refuse to give. Scratching only drives the parasites deeper into the fabric and opens fresh wounds to the filthy air. You force your mind to detach from the physical torment, focusing instead on the rhythmic drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the corridor. The repetitive sound becomes a grim metronome, ticking away the long, agonizing hours of the night. You pull yourself up to a sitting position, the rusty springs shrieking in protest under the sudden change in posture. The lack of ventilation traps the exhalations of 50 men, creating a suffocating miasma that burns the back of your throat. You slide your legs over the edge of the iron frame, your bare feet meeting the freezing, splintered floorboards. Reaching under the mattress, you retrieve your boots and the crumpled newspaper wadding you placed there for insulation. The leather is stiff and unyielding, resisting your attempts to force your swollen heels inside. You tie the frayed laces with numb, clumsy fingers, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere of the dormitory. Remaining in the bed any longer feels akin to accepting a slow, quiet death by suffocation and exposure. You navigate the narrow aisle between the crowded beds with measured caution. The floorboards groan under your boots, threatening to wake the men who have finally succumbed to exhaustion. You step over an outstretched arm hanging limp from a sagging mattress, the skin pale and dusted with soot. The doorway offers a slight reprieve from the concentrated stench, though the hallway carries its own unique brand of decay. You descend the steep wooden staircase, keeping one hand pressed against the damp plaster wall for balance. The shadows cluster tightly in the corners, undisturbed by the single, sputtering gas jet located at the bottom landing. The silence of the stairwell feels unnatural, a tense prelude to the grinding noise that will resume at dawn. The descent takes you closer to the street, drawing you back into the orbit of the city's unforgiving machinery. You take a seat on an overturned wooden crate near the edge of the hearth in the common kitchen. A handful of fellow insomniacs huddle around the bank fire, seeking the faint warmth radiating from the cooling ash. A woman with a faded green shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders sits across from you, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked front door. She belongs to the class of unfortunate women who walk the local streets, currently paralyzed by the very real threat waiting outside in the fog. The recent murders in the district have fundamentally altered the nocturnal economy, driving those who normally rely on the darkness into the meager safety of the lodging houses. Her hands tremble as she clutches a battered tin cup, the knuckles white with sustained tension. You watch the orange embers pulse faintly beneath the gray ash, a dying reflection of the city's fading energy. The heavy wooden door rattles violently against its iron hinges as a powerful gust of wind hits the facade. The woman flinches, spilling a few drops of hot water onto her grimy skirt. You hear the distinct, heavy tread of the night soil men moving through the adjacent alleyway, their shovels scraping harshly against the cobblestones. They arrive in the deepest part of the night to empty the overflowing privy pits, performing the most degrading labor the city has to offer. The smell penetrates the walls almost immediately, a thick sulfurous wave of raw sewage and ammonia that coats the inside of your mouth. You press the sleeve of your coat over your nose, though the fabric already carries the stench of the river docks. The men outside work in grim silence, shoveling the accumulated filth into wooden carts bound for the agricultural fields beyond the city limits. The reality of their task underscores the desperate lengths required to earn a few shillings in the East End. You push out into the unforgiving chill of Dorset Street, leaving the suffocating air of the kitchen behind. The fog has thickened into a dense yellow-tinged soup, reducing visibility to less than an arm's length. You step carefully onto the slick pavement, your boots crunching softly on a layer of discarded coal cinder and broken glass. The darkness here is a predatory force, hiding the deep potholes and the desperate figures lurking in the recessed doorways. You hear the erratic, shuffling footsteps of someone approaching through the mist, the sound distorted by the heavy atmosphere. A young link boy emerges briefly into the faint glow of a corner lamp, his burning torch casting wild, dancing shadows against the brickwork. He vanishes just as quickly, swallowed whole by the descending smog, leaving you alone in the silent, oppressive gloom. You trace the mortar lines between the bricks with your gloved fingertips, using the tactile feedback to guide your path through the blindness. The route toward the river takes you past the row of shuttered sweatshops and decaying tenements. The air grows noticeably colder as you approach the Thames, the damp wind slicing straight through your inadequate clothing. You hear the water before you see it, a heavy rhythmic slapping against the wooden pilings of the wharf. The smell shifts from the localized stench of the privies to the vast industrial rot of the river itself. You lean against a salt-crusted barrel, staring out into the impenetrable blackness suspended over the moving current. The city feels abandoned in this isolated hour, an empty shell waiting for the return of the laborers. Faint, erratic lights bob along the edge of the exposed mudflats below the retaining wall. You squint through the swirling mist, identifying the small lanterns carried by the mudlarks working the low tide. These are primarily starving children, sinking up to their knees in the toxic sewage-laden sludge to scavenge for scraps of coal or rusted metal. The freezing water numbs their legs while the noxious spumes rising from the mud attack their developing lungs. You watch a small figure hoist the heavy, misshapen object out of the muck, the lantern light catching the gleam of twisted iron. They perform this desperate salvage operation every night, trading their immediate health for the few pennies required to buy a loaf of alum-laced bread. The sheer scale of the exploitation sits heavily in your chest, a bleak reality that defies any attempt at rationalization. The river offers its meager bounty only to those willing to risk everything to claim it. You turn away from the riverfront, your jaw clenched tight against the shivering that threatens to overtake your frame. The wind shifts direction, carrying the distant, hollow chime of a clock tower striking 3. Walking generates a meager amount of internal heat, forcing you to maintain a steady, purposeful pace through the deserted thoroughfares. You pass a sprawling gin palace, its massive plate glass windows dark and vacant, the brass fittings tarnished by the corrosive air. The architectural grandeur of the building mocks the abject poverty surrounding it, a temple of artificial forgetting built squarely in the center of inescapable misery. You kick a loose cobblestone into the gutter, the sharp clatter echoing loudly down the empty street. The isolation of the deep night amplifies every sound, turning minor disturbances into potential threats. Your senses remain on high alert, parsing the shadows for any sign of movement. You spot the glowing red coals of a vendor's brazier burning bravely against the oppressive fog near the junction of Commercial Street. The specialized coffee stall operates here, catering exclusively to the nocturnal workforce. You approach the small gathering of exhausted men, their faces smeared with soot and their shoulders slumped in collective defeat. The promise of a hot liquid overrides the knowledge of its dubious quality, prompting you to hand over one of your precious copper coins. You receive a battered tin mug filled with a dark, steaming brew that smells vaguely of burnt earth. The coffee is bitter and gritty, cut thick with roasted chicory and other unnamed fillers. But the heat sears your tongue in a welcome shock. You cup your bare hands around the metal, absorbing the warmth directly into your aching joints. The brief respite provides a tiny island of comfort amidst the sprawling deprivation. The men around the stall speak in low, guarded tones, exchanging rumors about the available work for the coming day. You listen without participating, gathering the crucial intelligence needed to navigate the morning hiring queues. A massive, broad-shouldered man complains bitterly about a foreman at the West India docks, his voice carrying the deep rumble of chronic lung irritation. Another laborer mentions a ship arriving with a cargo of guano, a horrific job that pays slightly more due to the blinding, toxic dust. You evaluate the options, silently weighing the potential physical damage against the absolute necessity of earning fourpence. The bitter coffee scalds its way down your throat, settling in your empty stomach with a heavy, acidic presence. The vendor watches the group with practiced apathy. His only concern, the steady exchange of hot water for cold copper. The camaraderie here is transient, born of shared suffering and dissolved the moment the wages run dry. You hand the empty tin mug back across the wooden counter, the brief surge of artificial energy already beginning to fade. The walk back toward the center of Whitechapel is an exercise in pure mechanical endurance, placing one frozen foot in front of the other. You pass the formidable brick facade of the local workhouse, its uniform windows staring out like sightless eyes. The institution represents the absolute floor of Victorian society, a place of calculated degradation designed to make starvation seem preferable. You remember the stories of the oakum picking, the bleeding fingers, and the forced silence of the dining halls. The sheer terror of ending up behind those walls drives every exhausting step you take on the outside. You pick up your pace, desperate to put distance between yourself and the looming threat of the poorhouse. The stone walls seem to radiate a cold that transcends the physical temperature of the street. The fog begins to take on a slightly luminous quality, signaling the slow, agonizing approach of the pre-dawn hours. You navigate a narrow alleyway connecting two major streets, the brick walls pressing in close on both sides. A sudden scuffle in the darkness ahead makes you freeze in your tracks, your heart hammering against your ribs. You press your back flat against the cold, damp masonry, holding your breath and straining to identify the source of the conflict. Two figures wrestle violently in the shadows, the dull thud of a fist striking bone echoing clearly in the confined space. You slide slowly backward, retreating the way you came, refusing to become collateral damage in a dispute over stolen goods or bad debts. The streets require a constant, exhausting calculation of risk, demanding that you prioritize your own safety above all other concerns. Survival often means knowing when to walk away from the unseen battles of the slums. You circle around the block, taking a longer, safer route back toward the main thoroughfare. The physical exertion of the detour drains your remaining reserves, leaving your legs trembling with profound weakness. You find a relatively sheltered doorway beneath a jutting stone balcony and wedge yourself into the corner to conserve heat. The stone is freezing, but it blocks the worst of the cut and wind coming off the river. You cross your arms over your chest and tuck your chin down, creating a small, insulated pocket for your face. The waiting is always the hardest part, the endless span of empty time before the city officially wakes and the struggle for wages resumes. You focus entirely on the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat, a tiny engine of survival running on fumes. The shadows stretch out long and distorted, playing tricks on your exhausted mind. A crossing sweeper arrives at the adjacent intersection, a boy no older than 8 dragging a heavy birch broom. He begins pushing the accumulated filth of the night into neat piles along the gutter, his small face set in lines of grim determination. You watch him work in the dim light, his thin coat offering virtually no protection against the penetrating cold. He stops occasionally to blow on his bare, dirt-encrusted hands, the white puffs of his breath disappearing instantly into the smog. The sight is a stark reminder of the relentless economic machine that consumes the city's youth without hesitation or remorse. You reach into your pocket, feeling the edge of a single copper coin, but you know you cannot afford the luxury of charity today. The guilt sits heavy alongside the hunger, two distinct pains competing for your attention. The boy continues his labor, an invisible fixture in a landscape built on indifference. The rhythmic clatter of a heavy dray cart breaks the deep silence of the street, the iron-shod hooves of the draft horses striking sparks from the cobbles. The driver shouts a coarse command, his voice harsh and thick with sleep. The movement signals the first genuine stirring of the commercial day. The massive gears of London slowly grinding into motion. You push yourself away from the stone doorway, your joints popping and grinding in vocal protest. The cold has settled deep into your bones, a pervasive ache that no amount of walking will entirely dispel. You join the sparse flow of early traffic, a singular figure merging into the collective machinery of the working poor. The darkness remains absolute, but the anticipation of the coming labor charges the air with a tense, nervous energy. The prospect of finding work pulls you forward, overriding the protests of your battered muscles. You approach the entrance to a large sweatshop, the windows already glowing with the harsh light of internal gas lamps. Dozens of women queue outside the iron gate, their heads wrapped in thin shawls, waiting for the foreman to admit the day's shift. They stand in silence, conserving their energy for the grueling 14 hours of piecework ahead. The smell of hot irons and scorched fabric drifts out into the street, a stark contrast to the damp rot of the alleyways. You walk past the line, catching a glimpse of a young girl's hollow, exhausted eyes before she looks away. The exploitation is entirely visible, laid bare on the pavement for anyone to see, yet it continues unchecked and unchallenged. You pull your collar tighter against your neck, continuing your march toward the docks. The sheer volume of suffering on display serves as a brutal reminder of your own precarious position. You cough into your sleeve, the harsh sound tearing at your raw throat as a deeper bank of fog rolls in from the east. The air pressure shifts slightly, bringing with it the bitter taste of industrial smoke and chemical waste. The constant assault on your respiratory system is a fact of life you have long since accepted. A slow corrosion, paid as the price of admission to the city. You pass a small church, its iron gates securely locked against the destitute seeking shelter in its pews. The massive stone walls offer a silent, imposing testament to a salvation that feels disconnected from the reality of the streets. You trace the intricate carving of a gargoyle perched above the door, its grotesque face mirroring the grim endurance required to survive below. The religious architecture feels like a relic from a different world, irrelevant to the immediate calculus of bread and copper. The contrast between spiritual promise and physical deprivation is sharp and unyielding. A group of night shift workers emerges from a subterranean printing press, their faces smeared with black ink and profound fatigue. They move with the stiff, uncoordinated gait of men pushed far beyond their physical limits. You step aside to let them pass, granting them the small courtesy of an unobstructed path toward their beds. The interaction is brief and wordless, a shared understanding among those trapped in the endless cycle of extreme labor. You watch them disappear into the mist, their heavy boots dragging against the pavement. The city operates on these invisible shifts, a continuous rotation of bodies ensuring the engines of commerce never truly idle. You focus on your own destination, the massive brick warehouses waiting by the river's edge. The flow of human capital is constant, a river of flesh feeding the mechanical heart of the empire. The darkness begins to dilute, transitioning from pitch black to the familiar bruised gray of a London morning. The gas lamps flutter and hiss, their light rendered obsolete by the slow, agonizing arrival of dawn. You cross the final intersection before the dockyards, your legs burning with the effort of the long, cold walk. The air here is sharp with the scent of salt water and rotting timber, the undeniable signature of the Thames. Hundreds of men have already gathered at the gates, a desperate, shifting sea of flat caps and ragged coats. You take your place at the back of the massive crowd, mentally preparing for the brutal physical contest of the call-on. The night has been endured, but the true test of your survival is only just beginning. The cycle resets itself, demanding another sacrifice of bone and sinew to the demands of the day. You watch as metal hinges shriek, the heavy dock gates crashing open to silence the murmuring crowd. The dock foreman steps out onto his raised platform, his eyes sweeping over the desperate sea of men like a buyer inspecting damaged goods. You push forward with the rest of the tide, raising your hand high to catch his attention in the dim, watery light. The selection begins with sharp, barking commands. Fingers point and seal fates for the next 10 hours. Men around you surge toward the entrance, their faces hardened masks of determination and fear. You try to hold your ground. A larger man shoves past your shoulder, driving his elbow hard into your ribs. The foreman's gaze slides right past you, resting instead on a group of burly Irish laborers standing near the brick wall. You stand frozen as heavy iron swings shut with a hollow clang, locking out the unchosen majority. A collective groan ripples through the remaining crowd. It sounds like 100 empty stomachs acknowledging their defeat all at once. The cold reality of unemployment settles heavily over your shivering frame. There will be no brass tally today, no guaranteed shillings waiting at the clerk's window when the sun goes down. The men disperse quickly, scattering to secure whatever scraps of casual labor might remain elsewhere. You turn your back on the river, the bitter wind biting through your damp coat as you head north toward the denser slums. The arithmetic of survival must be recalculated immediately. If you intend to sleep indoors tonight, morning mist burns off slightly as the day progresses, revealing the grim brick architecture of the Whitechapel rookeries. You navigate a tight cluster of narrow courts, where the buildings lean toward each other to block out the sky. The smell here is dense and complicated. Decaying cabbage layers over the sharp sting of overflowing privies and stale coal smoke. A line of women has already formed at the communal water tap in the center of the yard, their battered iron buckets clanking together in the gloom. The water trickles out in a reluctant, murky stream, carrying the invisible threat of cholera straight into their homes. You watch a barefoot child carrying a sloshing pitcher back to a dark doorway, her small face pinched with the effort. You turn down a narrow alley known for its unregulated tailoring workshops, desperate to secure day-rate piecework. The entrance is a dark hole in a crumbling brick facade, emitting the sour odor of unwashed wool and human sweat. You climb a treacherous flight of rotting wooden stairs, the treads sagging dangerously under your boots. The supervisor, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a permanent scowl, barely looks up from his ledger when you ask for a place. He points a pencil toward a long wooden bench at the back of the stifling room, indicating your spot among the hunched figures. The air inside is thick with fabric dust, floating like a dry, choking fog in the shafts of weak daylight, filtering through the grime-caked window. You take your seat beside an older woman who coughs into a stained handkerchief, her hands never stopping their frantic motion. Canvas trousers sit in a rough pile on the scarred wood in front of you, accompanied by a dull needle and a spool of coarse black thread. Your assigned task is finishing the heavy cuffs, a repetitive motion requiring speed rather than skill. You thread the needle with stiff, clumsy fingers, the cold from the street still numbing your joints. The payment is calculated by the dozen, a fraction of a penny for each completed garment, demanding an inhuman pace just to afford a single loaf of bread. Silence in the room is broken only by the snip of heavy shears and the raspy breathing of 30 exhausted workers. You push the needle through the tough canvas, the dull metal biting into the callous pad of your thumb. Blood spots would ruin the merchandise and forfeit your pay. You work with tense, agonizing precision. Hours bleed together in the cramped, airless space, the repetitive labor forcing your mind into a dull, protective trance. Your shoulders ache from hunching over the bench, the muscles seizing into hard knots beneath your thin shirt. The supervisor paces the narrow aisle between the tables, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the bare floorboards. He snatches a pair of finished trousers from a young boy near the front, inspecting the seams with a critical, unforgiving eye. A harsh reprimand rings out. A sharp slat follows, making several workers flinch without pausing their own stitching. The fear of dismissal hangs over the room like a physical weight, driving the needles faster despite the growing cramps in everyone's hands. You finish your first dozen and add them to the completed pile, the meager progress offering no real comfort. Dust from the cheap fabric coats the inside of your mouth, tasting faintly of chemical dye and old dirt. You reach for a chipped enamel cup resting near your elbow, taking a small sip of the tepid water provided by the workshop. The liquid tastes heavily of iron and something vaguely organic, a direct product of the contaminated Thames. Thirst leaves you little choice but to swallow it, ignoring the very real possibility of the illness it might carry. The woman beside you stops stitching for a brief second, closing her eyes, as a wave of intense coughing rocks her frail frame. She wipes a speck of blood from her lips before picking up her needle again, her pace frantic to make up for the lost seconds. Heat in the room rises steadily, generated by 30 bodies trapped in a space designed for 10. You focus solely on the sharp tip of the needle, watching it dive in and out of the rough canvas. The hypnotic rhythm of the work blocks out the outside streets, leaving only the immediate reality of thread and fabric. Your back screams in protest. It begs for a moment to stretch and relieve the crushing pressure on your spine. The small window offers no distraction, its glass so thick with accumulated grime that it merely suggests the existence of daylight. A cart rumbles past in the street below, the vibrations traveling up through the brick walls and shaking the wooden bench. You calculate your earnings in your head, realizing that another 4 hours of this will barely cover a bed and a cup of watered milk. The math of the sweated labor system is a deliberate trap, designed to extract maximum effort for minimum survival. You push the needle harder, using the pain in your thumb to distract from the hollow ache in your center. By mid-morning, the hunger you ignored at dawn returns with a vicious, gnawing intensity. The empty cavern of your stomach contracts painfully, a physical demand for fuel that you cannot currently provide. A girl across the table faints, quietly slumping forward onto a pile of unfinished shirts without making a sound. 2 other women simply haul her upright, propping her against the wall until consciousness returns, their own hands never ceasing their labor. Sickness and collapse are routine inconveniences here, handled with a brutal efficiency that leaves no room for pity. You pull the thread tight on another cuff, severing it with your teeth, tasting the bitter dye of the cheap wool. You stand up carefully when the supervisor announces a 5-minute cessation of work, a brief window to use the yard privy before the relentless pace resumes. Your knees pop as the stiff joints bear your weight once more. The descent down the rotting stairs feels treacherous, your legs weak and trembling from the sustained immobility. Out in the narrow alley, the daylight is a pale, sickly yellow, filtering through the permanent canopy of coal smoke. The privy smells of lime and concentrated human waste, a vile combination that makes your eyes water instantly. You lean against the damp brick wall, taking a few shallow breaths of the outside air, deciding it is only marginally better than the dust inside. The brief respite is already slipping away, the heavy machinery of the day demanding your immediate return. You drag yourself back up the wooden steps, the brief exposure to the cold street having done nothing to revive your flagging energy. The supervisor stands by the door, a pocket watch resting in his open palm, tracking every lost second of productivity. You slide back onto the polished wood of the bench, picking up the rough canvas before you are fully seated. The needle feels heavier now. The repetitive motion has drained the strength from your fingers. The woman beside you has fallen behind, her stitches growing erratic as exhaustion overtakes her practiced skill. You quietly pull 2 of her unfinished pieces onto your pile, absorbing her workload without exchanging a single glance or word. It is a small, dangerous act of solidarity in a room built solely on ruthless competition. Beyond the thick glass, the clock on the distant church tower chimes the mid-morning hour, the sound barely penetrating the workshop. You wipe a line of sweat from your forehead, smearing fabric dust across your brow in the dark streak. The heat in the room has become oppressive, a stagnant swamp of human breath and drying glue used for stiffening collars. You watch a bead of moisture run down the grimy pane, tracing a clean line through years of accumulated soot. The light filtering through the streak reveals the sheer volume of particulate matter floating in the air, a solid wall of fibers you are constantly breathing. Your lungs ache with a dull, persistent heaviness. You push the needle through the final layer of canvas, tying off the knot with practiced automatic precision. You organize your finished cuffs into a neat pile when the supervisor calls for the morning collection. A flurry of anxious movement ripples along the long wooden benches. He walks down the line with a large canvas sack, sweeping the completed garments inside while marking his ledger with sharp, heavy strokes. When he reaches your station, he inspects the top piece, pulling hard on the seam to test the strength of your thread. The stitches hold, and he marks a tally next to your name without a word of acknowledgement. You calculate that your morning labor has earned you exactly tuppence, half the cost of a bed for the night. The grim reality of the arithmetic settles over you. demanding that the afternoon be worked at twice the speed just to survive. You file out of the suffocating room as the midday bells finally toll across Whitechapel, signaling a sanctioned pause in the relentless grind. The supervisor locks his ledger and waves a dismissive hand, releasing the exhausted workers for a brief 30-minute reprieve. Your legs feel heavy and uncoordinated. Descending the dark stairwell to the street takes concentrated effort. The air outside bites at your sweat-dampened shirt, causing a harsh shiver to rack your frame. The street is swarming with laborers, all moving with the same desperate urgency to secure a few scraps of cheap food. You clutch your 2 hard-earned pennies in your pocket, heading toward a familiar street cart parked near the corner of Brick Lane. The morning is over, but the brutal mathematics of the day are far from balanced. You reach the battered wooden cart just as a light, stinging drizzle begins to coat the bruised apples and wilting cabbages. The vendor offers a greasy slab of coarse bread smeared with rendered pork dripping for a single penny. You hand over one of your hard-earned coins, feeling the cold copper leave your stiff grasp. The animal fat has a slightly rancid edge, burning the back of your throat with a sharp, unpleasant acidity. The bread itself is unnaturally white, artificially bleached with a heavy dose of alum that leaves a bitter, chalky residue on your tongue. Hunger demands that you swallow every single bite regardless of the corrosive chemical aftertaste. You eat standing upright against the damp brick wall, shielding the meager meal from the aggressive street dogs circling the muddy intersection. You wipe the residual grease from your mouth with the back of your frayed woolen sleeve. Securing the remaining penny deep in your pocket, you scan the chaotic thoroughfare for any immediate opportunity to sell your raw labor. A heavy coal wagon rushes to a violent halt in front of a nearby public house, the massive draft horse blowing wet clouds of steam from its flaring nostrils. The driver curses loudly, struggling to maneuver the iron-rimmed wheels over a deep, treacherous rut in the slick cobblestones. You step forward instantly, offering your strong back to haul the heavy fuel sacks down into the cramped tavern cellar. The man nods, once offering a crude halfpenny for every load successfully delivered into the dark subterranean chute. The work is extraordinarily filthy and fraught with danger, but pride holds absolutely no currency in the desolate East End. You heave the first rough canvas sack onto your right shoulder, the coarse fabric biting instantly through your thin shirt into your collarbone. Black dust billows directly into your face, coating your sweaty skin and stinging your unprotected eyes with blinding grit. The descent into the cellar is treacherous, the rotting wooden steps completely slick with old, damp, and crushed coal fragments. You hold your breath in the lightless, suffocating void below, dumping the heavy load and hurrying back up toward the gray sky. The physical rhythm takes over your battered frame, a brutal, unbroken cycle of lifting, carrying, and climbing. Each trip leaves another layer of thick, abrasive grime firmly embedded in your exposed pores. Your knees pop and grind with the added weight fiercely protesting the sudden shift from the stationary workshop bench. You feel the sharp, jagged edges of the coal chunks pressing through the thin canvas right into your aching spine. The sulfurous smell of the raw fuel is completely overwhelming, catching deep in the back of your throat and triggering a harsh, jagged cough. The driver shouts from his elevated perch, demanding a faster pace, while outright refusing to offer a single hand with the heavy lifting. Black sweat stings your eyes, creating thick, muddy tracks down your heavily soiled face. You blink away the burning sensation, focusing entirely on the precarious, slippery footing of the cellar stairs. The sheer volume of coal required to heat this sprawling city is staggering, and every single ounce must be moved by sheer human muscle. You grab another sack without pausing for breath, determined to extract every possible fraction of a penny from this miserable, suffocating task. You finish hauling the last load just as the afternoon light shifts into a dull, bruised purple across the jagged rooflines. The driver carelessly tosses 3 copper coins onto the wet pavement, forcing you to stoop and scramble in the mud for your wages. You secure the money tightly in your fist, ignoring the burning humiliation in favor of the cold, hard mathematics of urban survival. The street traffic has intensified into a chaotic, lethal flow of heavy omnibuses, erratic hansom cabs, and frantic pedestrians. You navigate the chaotic crossing with extreme prejudice, knowing a single misstep beneath those iron-shod hooves means certain, unceremonious death. The sheer noise of the main thoroughfare is deafening, a relentless mechanical roar that batters relentlessly against your exhausted senses. You weave between the massive, steaming draft horses, inhaling the sharp, ammoniac scent of fresh manure and wet leather trappings. You push southward toward the river, seeking a slightly cheaper lodging house rumored to exist deep near the dilapidated wharves. The air grows noticeably thicker as you approach the Thames, carrying the potent, unmistakable stench of raw, unprocessed sewage. You remember the grim tales of the Great Stink, a terrifying summer when the river boiled with such foulness that the entire city choked on its own festering refuse. The dark water churns sluggishly against the massive stone embankments, a toxic, pulsing artery feeding the sprawling industrial empire. You spot a communal iron pump jutting from the pavement, surrounded by a shallow, spreading pool of stagnant, iridescent sludge. The agonizing thirst burning in your throat demands immediate relief, despite your profound knowledge of the invisible poisons lurking in the municipal supply. You pump the rusted handle twice, catching a handful of the murky liquid and swallowing it quickly before your rational mind can object. You wipe the foul-tasting water from your chin and continue your steady march through the tightening labyrinth of brick and mortar. The buildings here are packed so intensely densely that the sky is reduced to a narrow, ragged ribbon of gray hovering far above the chimney pots. Children run wild in the filthy gutters, their small, pinched faces smeared with the same black soot that coats the surrounding factory walls. You pass a blind beggar playing a battered accordion, the reedy, mournful notes completely drowned out by the thunderous crash of a nearby iron forge. The energy of the slums is frantic and entirely focused on surviving the next few treacherous hours. Women shout down from open, broken windows, hanging threadbare laundry on sagging lines strung between the crumbling facades. You keep your head down and your hands buried in your pockets, projecting an aura of grim determination to deter the casual thieves watching from the alleyways. You reach the forbidding entrance of a notorious rookery, a dark, gaping archway leading directly into a sprawling, chaotic courtyard. The density of human life here defies all modern comprehension, with entire extended families packed into single, windowless rooms. The stench of the overflowing shared privies hits you like a physical blow, a concentrated, invisible wall of ammonia and decaying organic matter. You step carefully over a rotting pile of discarded cabbage leaves, navigating the treacherous landscape of the inner court. The hotbed system dominates these specific tenants, meaning the mattress you secure tonight will likely still hold the fading body heat of a day laborer. You search the shadows for the keeper's door, hoping your newly earned coppers will grant you a slightly cleaner corner of the sprawling squalor. The brick walls seem to lean inward, maliciously trapping the misery in a localized, inescapable cage of poverty. You find a battered wooden door marked with a crude chalk cross, and not firmly on the splintered, weathered surface. A man with a deeply scarred cheek opens it, a fraction assessing your physical worth with a cold, thoroughly professional gaze. You display your 4 copper coins without speaking a single word, relying on the universal language of commerce to cut through the hostile atmosphere. He snatches the money instantly and shoves a numbered wooden tally into your calloused palm, gesturing vaguely toward a dark, narrow stairwell. The transaction lacks any trace of human warmth, reducing your existence to a simple, brutal exchange of currency for a horizontal space. You step into the gloomy corridor, the smell of damp, rotting plaster and old sickness immediately filling your damaged lungs. The promise of shelter is officially secured, but the cost to your dignity and long-term health remains exceptionally steep. You climb the uneven wooden steps, the sagging boards groaning ominously beneath your soot-caked boots. The shadows in the stairwell are profound and absolute, offering ample hiding places for the desperate, predatory elements of the rookery. You keep your back pressed close to the damp wall, listening intently for the sudden scrape of a boot or the quiet whisper of drawn steel. The ambient noise of the building is a chaotic, overlapping symphony of domestic disputes, crying infants, and the harsh hacking of diseased lungs. The sheer volume of suffering contained within these brick walls is overwhelming, pressing down on your shoulders like an immense physical weight. You reach the 3rd floor landing, the air growing noticeably hotter and staler with the accumulated body heat of the crowded rooms. The wooden tally in your hand points you toward a large open dormitory situated at the very end of the hall. You push open the heavy, reinforced door, entering a long room crammed with dozens of narrow, rusted iron bedsteads. The heat inside is suffocating, a thick soup of coal smoke, unwashed flesh, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap, illicit gin. Several men are already occupying their assigned spaces, their bodies completely motionless in the tight grip of profound physical exhaustion. You locate your specific number near the far wall, a precarious spot located directly beneath a perpetually leaking section of the plaster roof. The mattress is stuffed with coarse, unyielding straw, the rough stalks poking sharply through the thin, heavily stained ticking. You drop your weary frame onto the edge of the bed, ignoring the immediate frantic rustle of vermin fleeing the sudden disturbance. The physical relief of sitting down is momentarily more powerful than the absolute disgust of your squalid surroundings. You examine the dark, bruised flesh of your hands. In the dim light filtering through the single grimy window pane, the pervasive coal dust has worked its way deep into every crack and crevice, leaving permanent dark lines across your hardened calluses. The brutal needlework from the morning has left your thumbs swollen and tender, while your broad shoulders ache fiercely from the afternoon's heavy hauling. The city systematically extracts its toll piece by piece, wearing down your physical reserves until there is nothing left to trade. You rub your throbbing temples vigorously, trying to ward off the dull headache brought on by the toxic air and contaminated river water. The noise from the courtyard below filters constantly through the thin glass, a relentless reminder that the struggle continues unabated just outside. You take a slow, calculated breath, carefully measuring the remaining strength in your battered, overworked body. You sit perfectly still, watching the gray light in the room slowly fade into the deep, bruised purple of early evening. The dormitory steadily fills as more laborers return from the docks and factories, each bringing their own distinct, pungent odor of industrial decay. The silence between the men is absolute, a shared, unspoken understanding that unnecessary conversation only wastes precious, irreplaceable energy. A man 2 beds over begins to carefully wrap a dirty, blood-stained rag around a deep, weeping gash on his forearm. You look away immediately, knowing that offering assistance is dangerous and actual medical supplies are entirely non-existent. The brutal isolation of extreme poverty forces everyone to become a heavily guarded island of self-preservation. You focus on the steady drip of water from the ceiling, counting the drops as a way to anchor your mind against the encroaching despair. You feel the cold dampness of the room seeping through your thin coat, prompting a desperate, gnawing desire for external warmth. The remaining penny in your pocket burns a hole against your thigh, representing the agonizing choice between a tiny scrap of food tomorrow or a brief escape tonight. You know the local pub offers a roaring fire and a pint of watered porter for exactly that price. The promise of heat and human noise is a powerful narcotic, drawing exhausted men away from the miserable isolation of the lodging houses. You trace the edge of the coin with your thumb heavily weighing the immediate comfort against the certain hunger of the coming dawn. The temperance movement constantly preaches against this exact temptation, but their well-fed moralizing holds absolutely no weight in the freezing reality of the slums. You remain seated on the straw mattress, temporarily paralyzed by the impossible arithmetic of destitution. You watch a lamplighter through the dirty glass, his long pole sparking a single gas jet to life in the alley far below. The sudden pool of yellow light reveals a rat scurrying aggressively along the gutter, searching for scraps among the discarded, rotting refuse. The evening fog begins its nightly, inexorable ascent from the river, wrapping the brick facades in a thick, suffocating embrace. The transition from day to night in Whitechapel does not bring any relief. It simply changes the specific nature of the hazards you must navigate. The criminals replace the foremen, and the treacherous shadows replace the sweatshops. You pull your knees up tight to your chest, wrapping your arms tightly around your legs to conserve vital body heat. The room plunges into near total darkness as the remaining daylight finally surrenders completely to the smog. You push yourself up from the coarse straw mattress, the decision made by the overwhelming demand of your freezing muscles rather than any logical calculation. The single penny resting in your pocket represents the entirety of your liquid assets, a tiny copper disc holding the power to purchase 2 hours of artificial warmth. The dormitory has become a tomb of freezing, stagnant air, filled with the ragged breathing of men attempting to sleep through their starvation. You step quietly past the rows of iron bedsteads, your boots making soft, dull thuds against the warped wooden floorboards. The descent down the pitch-black stairwell requires sliding your hand along the damp plaster wall, feeling your way through the absolute absence of light. the lodging house keeper ignores your departure entirely, her attention fixed on a broken piece of slate where she marks the night's meager profits. The cold of Dorset Street hits you with the physical force of a heavy physical blow, slicing instantly through the thin, worn fabric of your coat. The fog has claimed the narrow alleyways entirely, turning the atmosphere into a thick sulfurous fluid that tastes distinctly of burning coal and rusted iron. You pull your collar up high around your neck, burying your chin in the stiff wool to protect your raw throat from the abrasive smog. The gas lamps scattered along the thoroughfare struggle to project their light more than a few feet, creating isolated, sickly yellow bubbles suspended in the gloom. You navigate from one fragile pool of illumination to the next, keeping a watchful eye on the treacherous, shifting shadows between the posts. The evening traffic has thinned out, replaced by the stealthy, deliberate movements of the East End's nocturnal predators. You recognize the towering, aggressive facade of a massive gin palace looming on the next corner, its vast plate glass windows radiating a brilliant, mocking light. The architectural grandeur feels like a deliberate insult to the surrounding squalor. An ornate temple of polished brass and imported marble built specifically to extract the last pennies from the desperate. You stare at the gilded lettering above the heavy mahogany doors, feeling the harsh contrast between the warm, glittering interior and the freezing, muddy pavement beneath your feet. Women in ragged shawls stand near the entrance, their faces painted in pathetic imitations of health, hoping to catch the eye of a patron with a spare coin. You cross the street to avoid the glaring illumination, knowing that such establishments cater to a level of artificial forgetting you cannot afford to indulge tonight. The sheer scale of the wealth required to build such a place in the middle of a slum is a sickening testament to the economics of addiction. You turn away from the main road and head deeper into the labyrinth of Brick Lane, seeking the familiar, battered wooden sign of the local public house. The Drum offers none of the polished marble or glaring gaslights of the larger palaces, relying instead on the simple, vital promise of a roaring hearth and cheap porter. The heavy oak door groans loudly as you push your shoulder against it, yielding to reveal a dense, suffocating wall of heat and human noise. The smell hits you in distinct, overpowering layers. A potent mixture of spilled ale, burning cheap tobacco, damp wool coats, and the sharp tang of sweat. You step inside and let the heavy door swing shut, instantly severing the connection to the freezing, hostile streets of Whitechapel. The transition from the isolated terror of the fog to the packed, communal warmth of the tavern is a jarring physical shock to your system. You weave your way through the dense crowd of standing patrons, sliding past broad-shouldered dockers and exhausted factory hands seeking their nightly reprieve. The noise level is a continuous, deafening roar, comprised of dozens of simultaneous arguments, bursts of harsh laughter, and the clattering of heavy glass mugs against wooden tables. You reach the long, scarred wooden bar and press a single copper penny onto the damp surface, securing the attention of the overworked publican. He slides a chipped glass mug filled with dark, foaming porter across the wood. Snatching the coin without breaking his continuous rhythm of pouring and serving, you wrap your freezing, calloused hands around the thick glass, absorbing the ambient temperature of the room before raising the heavy liquid to your lips. The beer is bitter and heavily watered down, but it carries a dark, roasted flavor that immediately coats the back of your dry throat. You find a narrow sliver of space on a wooden bench near the back wall, sliding in beside an older man deeply engaged in dissecting a bruised turnip. The heat from the large iron stove in the center of the room slowly penetrates your damp clothing, thawing the stiff, painful knots in your shoulders and spine. This tavern functions as the designated living room for hundreds of displaced workers, providing the fundamental comforts of light and warmth that their rented beds entirely lack. You take a slow, deliberate swallow of the porter, letting the mild alcohol content spread a faint, comforting numbness through your exhausted limbs. The temperance movement actively condemns these spaces as dens of ultimate moral decay, failing utterly to understand that the alcohol is merely a secondary mechanism for survival. The true product being sold here is a temporary cessation of misery, a few hours of mandated belonging in a city that otherwise refuses to acknowledge your existence. You watch the diverse cross-section of poverty interacting within the cramped, smoke-filled boundaries of the public house. A group of young costermongers argue vehemently over the price of bruised apples in the corner, their sharp, rapid slang forming a nearly impenetrable local dialect. Near the blazing stove, two women meticulously divide a loaf of bread, their hands moving with the precise, calculated economy of those who count every single crumb. You spot a man known locally as a scriber sitting alone at a small table, quietly forging letters of reference for a young girl seeking domestic service. The illegal transaction happens in plain sight, a desperate circumvention of a hiring system designed to keep the poor permanently excluded from respectable employment. The law dictates that such forgery is a severe crime, but the shared morality of the tavern recognizes it as a necessary tool for basic survival. You feel the atmosphere in the room undergo a sudden, profound shift as a woman steps onto a small, elevated wooden crate near the rear exit. She wears a faded blue dress that might have been elegant a decade ago, her posture radiating a quiet, absolute dignity that commands immediate respect. The chaotic roar of the tavern steadily diminishes, the arguments trailing off, and the clinking of glasses pausing as the patrons turn their attention toward the makeshift stage. You set your heavy mug down on the scarred table, sensing the collective anticipation rising among the hardened, cynical crowd. The publican stops wiping the bar, folding his rag and leaning forward against the polished wood with a look of genuine reverence. The silence that falls over the packed room is thick and heavy, charged with an emotional hunger that rivals the physical starvation waiting outside. You listen as she begins to sing without any instrumental accompaniment, her clear, piercing voice cutting effortlessly through the stale, smoke-filled air. The song is a slow, mournful ballad about a young soldier lost in a foreign war, a narrative of endless waiting and hope slowly grinding down into permanent despair. The melody is simple but executed with devastating emotional precision, carrying a profound sorrow that resonates with every person trapped in the room. You watch the faces of the dockers and the sweatshop workers soften, the hardened masks of survival slipping away to reveal the raw, vulnerable humanity hidden underneath. A burly man with deep coal scars across his cheeks stares down at his massive hands, a single tear cutting a clean track through the embedded grime. The singer understands her audience intimately, offering them a sanctioned vessel for the grief they are forced to suppress during the brutal daylight hours. You feel the music resonating deep within your own chest, striking chords of loss and isolation you have spent weeks carefully burying under the demands of physical labor. The song articulates the pervasive ache of the East End, transforming the ugly, chaotic reality of the slums into a moment of pure, transcendent beauty. The notes hang suspended in the stifling heat, weaving a temporary spell of unity among the desperate, disconnected individuals sharing the tavern space. You realize that this specific form of entertainment is not a frivolous luxury, but a vital, necessary mechanism for preserving the human spirit against relentless industrial crushing. The ability to feel something other than cold, hunger, and pain is a commodity far more valuable than the watered-down beer in your glass. She holds the final, haunting note for a long, breathtaking moment, letting the sound fade naturally into the heavy silence of the rapt audience. You join the sudden, explosive roar of applause that shatters the quiet, the patrons stamping their heavy boots and striking the wooden tables in fierce appreciation. Several men toss small copper coins toward the makeshift stage, sacrificing portions of their own meager survival funds to reward the brief emotional sanctuary she provided. You clap your calloused hands until the bruised skin stings, deeply grateful for the profound reminder that you are still capable of experiencing genuine beauty. The singer bows her head with a small, tired smile, gathering the scattered coins with practiced efficiency before stepping down and vanishing into the pressing crowd. The ambient noise of the tavern resumes its chaotic roar, but the underlying tension has been thoroughly bled away, replaced by a softer, more reflective atmosphere. You take another slow pull from your mug, savoring the remaining dark liquid while bathing in the lingering warmth of the shared emotional experience. You stretch your legs out under the heavy wooden table, the cramping in your calves slowly easing as the heat works its way through the damp denim. The mechanical clock mounted above the bar ticks steadily toward the late evening hours, marking the inevitable approach of the time when you must return to the freezing street. You mentally calculate the distance back to the lodging house, charting a route that avoids the most dangerous, unlit intersections of the district. The fog will be at its absolute thickest now, a dense, blinding wall of smog that reduces the sprawling city to a few isolated, suffocating yards of visibility. You decide to stretch the single pint of porter for as long as the publican will tolerate your lingering presence, squeezing every possible minute of heat from your solitary penny. The art of waiting becomes a refined skill, balancing the necessity of shelter against the strict unwritten rules of tavern patronage. You observe the subtle shift in the tavern's clientele as the evening pushes deeper toward the midnight boundary. The honest laborers who face the early morning call-on begin to drift away, pulling their collars tight before plunging back into the toxic mist. They are steadily replaced by the genuine denizens of the deep night, the individuals whose survival depends entirely upon the cover of absolute darkness. A pair of professional dips slide into a booth near the door, their eyes darting constantly as they quietly divide a collection of stolen silk handkerchiefs. You keep your gaze carefully averted, knowing that witnessing criminal commerce in the East End often carries a steep, violent penalty for the overly curious. The publican ignores the illicit transaction completely, adhering to the strict code of silence that governs all successful businesses operating within the slums. You finish the last bitter drops of the porter, feeling the faint, lingering warmth of the alcohol settling deep in your empty stomach. The glass clunks softly against the scarred wood, signaling the official end of your purchased sanctuary. You remain seated on the hard bench, delaying the inevitable departure by focusing on the intricate, swirling patterns of the wood grain beneath your resting hands. A sudden scuffle breaks out near the blazing iron stove. Two men shoving each other violently over a spilled drink or a perceived insult. The publican moves with surprising speed, vaulting the bar and driving a heavy wooden cudgel into the ribs of the instigator with practiced brutal efficiency. The violence flares and extinguishes in a matter of seconds, accepted by the crowd as a normal, unremarkable feature of their nightly routine. You push yourself away from the table, your joints immediately protesting the loss of the stove's radiant heat. The journey back to the lodging house looms ahead, a necessary trial that must be endured to secure a few hours of unconsciousness. You button your thin coat tight against your throat, mentally preparing your battered frame for the brutal assault of the freezing damp. The heavy oak door of the tavern stands between you and the reality of London, a wooden barrier holding back the crushing weight of the empire. You nod briefly to the publican as you pass, acknowledging the silent, transactional nature of the brief refuge he provided. The noise of the crowded room fades to a dull roar as you grasp the cold iron handle. Bracing yourself for the plunge into the suffocating yellow mist, you step across the worn wooden threshold, abandoning the vital sanctuary of the tavern for the desolate reality of the street. The heavy door swings shut behind you, instantly severing the roar of the crowd and plunging you into an oppressive, muffled silence. The temperature drop hits your damp clothing like a physical blow, seizing the muscles in your chest and forcing a ragged gasp from your lungs. The yellow fog has thickened during your time inside, transforming the thoroughfare into an impenetrable corridor of toxic vapor. You wrap your arms tight around your torso, trying desperately to trap the fading radiant heat absorbed from the iron stove. The smog tastes of raw sulfur and decaying organic matter, a foul combination that coats the inside of your mouth with a bitter residue. You focus your watering eyes on the cobblestones directly beneath your boots, the only objects visible in the overwhelming gloom. Shadows twist and distort in the limited illumination provided by a solitary sputtering gas lamp near the corner. The light fails to penetrate more than a few feet into the mist, creating a sickly glowing sphere that offers no real guidance. Brick walls rise on either side of the narrow lane, their damp surfaces slick with a greasy layer of condensed industrial soot. The silence of the deep night is profound, broken only by the distant rhythmic dripping of moisture from an unseen gutter. A stray dog slinks along the edge of the brickwork, its ribs showing starkly against its matted coat before it vanishes into the murk. The sheer density of the atmosphere distorts distance and direction, turning the familiar neighborhood into an alien, hostile landscape. The dampness penetrates the worn seams of your coat, carrying the distinct, freezing chill of the nearby river. You slide your gloved hand along the rough, freezing surface of the masonry, using the tactile feedback to navigate the treacherous path. The mortar lines provide a rigid physical anchor in a world that has otherwise dissolved into formless gray smoke. You slide your boots forward cautiously, testing the uneven pavement for hidden potholes or discarded refuse that could twist an ankle. A twisted ankle in this environment is a literal death sentence, a guaranteed loss of wages that leads directly to the workhouse or the gutter. You halt abruptly as a heavy iron-shod cart rumbles past in the obscurity. The massive draft horses invisible just yards away. The vibration travels up through the soles of your boots, the only warning of the lethal hazard passing in the night. You resume your blind progress only after the grinding noise fades into the distance. You detect a sudden, unexpected wave of dry heat radiating upward from a heavy iron grating set into the pavement ahead. The harsh smell of the fog is temporarily overpowered by the dense, heavy aroma of baking bread and the sharp, chemical tang of alum. You step onto the metal bars, letting the rising thermal current wash over your shivering frame in a sudden, glorious rush of warmth. Looking down through the iron grid reveals a subterranean bakery operating in the lightless depths of the East End night. A massive brick oven glows with a fierce, hellish orange light, illuminating the sweat-slicked torsos of 3 bakers working the night shift. They move with an exhausted, frantic rhythm, hauling massive wooden paddles loaded with dough into the searing heat of the fire. You stand mesmerized by the brutal choreography of their labor, absorbing the precious heat venting from their underground prison. Flour dust fills the subterranean cavern, catching the fiery glow and turning the air into a shimmering golden haze. The workers plunge their bare hands into enormous wooden troughs, kneading the heavy dough with a mechanical, desperate intensity. Their wages depend on the sheer volume of loaves produced before the morning carts arrive to distribute the cheap, adulterated bread across the slums. A sudden burst of sparks erupts from the open oven door, casting long, frantic shadows against the whitewashed cellar walls. The heat rising through the grate is intense enough to dry the damp wool of your coat, providing a fleeting island of physical comfort. The contrast between the freezing, toxic street and the scorching, airless cellar illustrates the relentless dual nature of poverty in the district. The men below do not look up. Their focus locks solely on the endless cycle of yeast and fire. You force yourself to step away from the grating, knowing the residual heat will only make the surrounding fog feel sharper and more vicious. The journey must continue before the brief burst of thermal energy dissipates into the freezing air. You turn onto a wider avenue lined with shuttered warehouses, the massive brick facades towering into the unseen sky above. The recent string of brutal murders hangs heavy over these specific streets, a palpable terror that changes the fundamental chemistry of the night. You keep your back straight and your pace brisk, attempting to project a confidence and strength you do not actually possess. The vulnerability of walking alone in this district is a constant grinding pressure that sits at the base of your skull. You scan the swirling yellow mist for any sign of movement, your survival instincts screaming at every shifting shadow. You freeze mid-step as the distinct, rhythmic sound of hard leather boots striking stone echoes from the darkness behind you. The footfalls are heavy and deliberate, matching your own pace with a terrifying, calculated precision. You press your spine flat against the icy brick of an adjacent warehouse, holding your breath and praying the fog conceals your silhouette. The stranger approaches, a featureless, looming shape emerging gradually from the impenetrable wall of smog. You slip a hand into your pocket, your fingers curling instinctively around a heavy iron bolt scavenged from the docks days ago. The metallic weight offers a pathetic illusion of security against the unknown threat moving through the mist. The figure passes within arm's reach. A broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat who never once turns his head in your direction. You release the breath you were holding in a ragged, silent exhale, the adrenaline leaving your limbs weak and trembling. Far above the street, the distant rumble of a night freight train vibrates through a massive, arched railway bridge. The iron structure spans the thoroughfare like the ribs of some colossal beast, shedding flakes of rust and freezing water onto the pavement below. The space beneath the massive brick arches serves as an informal, unsanctioned refuge for those who lack the fourpence required for a proper bed. Dozens of destitute figures huddle in the deepest shadows, sitting upright with their backs pressed against the damp, weeping brickwork. They sleep in a state of constant, shivering misery, their bodies wrapped in layers of discarded rags and old newspaper. The train passes overhead with a deafening, thunderous roar, shaking dust from the mortar and drowning out the harsh, hacking coughs of the unsheltered. The glowing cinders from the steam engine drift down like dying stars, extinguishing the moment they touch the wet cobblestones. You cross beneath the towering archway, keeping a respectful distance from the desperate souls claiming the meager shelter. The sheer scale of the human suffering concentrated in this single, dark corner defies any attempt at rationalization or comprehension. You lower your head and focus on the steady rhythm of your own footfalls, carrying the guilt of having a bed waiting for you at the end of the march. The cold has penetrated past your muscle tissue, settling into your bones with a dull, throbbing ache that makes every step an exercise in agony. You recognize the jagged, irregular roofline of your destination looming through the mist, the familiar silhouette offering a sudden surge of desperate relief. The physical limits of your endurance have been reached and surpassed, leaving only raw mechanical willpower to carry you the final few yards. You focus your entire consciousness on the heavy wooden door waiting at the end of the lane. You reach the entrance of the lodging house, your frozen fingers fumbling clumsily with the heavy rusted iron latch. The door yields with a protesting groan, revealing a pitch-black corridor that smells powerfully of carbolic acid and old unwashed wool. You step over the threshold, closing the door firmly against the creeping yellow fog and the various terrors of the Whitechapel night. The transition from the freezing street to the stagnant, tepid air of the interior causes your battered lungs to spasm in a fit of coughing. You muffle the harsh sound with your sleeve, wary of waking the exhausted laborers packed into the adjacent rooms. The keeper's small booth is empty, a single stub of a tallow candle pooling wax onto the scarred wooden counter. You stand in the dark hallway, letting the reality of your survival settle over your trembling frame. Silence in the building is far from an absolute void, composed instead of 100 tiny, miserable noises overlapping in the dark. The groaning of strained floorboards mixes with the restless shifting of bodies seeking a comfortable position on yielding flock mattresses. The air is thick and heavy, a recycled mixture of exhalations trapped within the poorly ventilated, overcrowded structure. A child whimpers from a room on the ground floor, the sound quickly silenced by a harsh, whispered reprimand. The sheer density of life packed into the tenement creates a collective radiating heat that takes the sharpest edge off the winter chill. The stairs rise upward into the gloom, a steep, treacherous climb separating the hallway from the promised relief of the dormitory. The flickering candle casts long, distorted shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper, adding a surreal quality to the squalid surroundings. You grip the splintered wooden banister, hauling your exhausted body up the narrow staircase one agonizing step at a time. The wood is slick with the accumulated grease of 1,000 unwashed hands that have made this exact climb before you. The muscles in your thighs burn with the effort, protesting the vertical ascent after the grueling miles walked across the uneven pavement. You reach the second floor landing, the darkness here so impenetrable that you must navigate solely by memory and touch. The air grows noticeably warmer and staler with each ascending floor, trapping the heat and the odor of the dozens of occupants. You count the doors along the corridor, tracing the uneven plaster walls until you find the familiar, jagged crack marking your assigned chamber. You push the thin wooden door open just wide enough to slip inside, entering the dense, suffocating atmosphere of the shared sleeping quarters. The room is a chaotic landscape of iron bedsteads and prone figures, the air humming with the ragged, uneven rhythm of communal rest. You locate your specific cot in the corner, the thin, lumpy mattress representing the ultimate goal of your entire grueling day. You sink onto the edge of the sagging bed, the rusted springs shrieking loudly in the quiet room. The man in the adjacent cot stirs, muttering a dark, slurred curse before rolling over and pulling his filthy blanket over his head. You untie your wet boots with numb, unresponsive fingers, prying the stiff leather away from your swollen, aching heels. The relief of freeing your trapped feet is immediate and intense, a sharp spike of physical pleasure in a day defined by pain. You place the boots carefully beneath the iron frame, ensuring they are positioned securely out of reach of any passing hands. The cold from the floorboards seeps through your damp socks, urging you to seek the meager insulation of the mattress. You pull your knees up to your chest, curling into a tight defensive ball against the encroaching chill. Dust motes dance lazily in the faint, sickly light filtering through the single, grimy, encrusted window pane. The shadows in the corner of the room seem to pulse and shift, a trick of the exhausted mind struggling to process the visual deprivation. The smell of cheap gin and sour sweat permeates the thin, scratchy blanket covering the lumpy straw ticking. The relentless noise of the city outside has finally faded to a dull, distant rumble, a mechanical heartbeat slowing down for the deepest hours of the night. The physical pain in the joints begins to mutate into a heavy, leaden numbness, the body initiating the process of shutting down. The hours stretch out ahead, a dark, uninterrupted span of time offering nothing but the pure, vital necessity of unconsciousness. The walls of the lodging house stand firm, a temporary fortress holding back the lethal machinery of the Victorian capital. You press your bruised knuckles against your closed eyelids, forcing the phantom shadows of the room to retreat. Sleep remains a distant, inaccessible territory guarded by the relentless throbbing in your spine. The deep night offers no true stillness here, only a concentrated distillation of the district's collective suffering. The raw blisters on your fingertips flare with a sudden, sharp heat, a vicious reminder of the grueling oakum picking from 4 days ago. Tar and salt seem permanently embedded under your cracked nails, staining the keratin a dark, sickly yellow. You clench your fists to suppress the phantom sting, the memory of the workhouse asserting its dominance over the present darkness. The institution never truly releases its grip on those who have worn its rough gray uniform. The distinct, hollow clatter of heavy boots rings out from the cobblestones far below the grimy window. You recognize the measured, deliberate cadence immediately as a patrol from the Metropolitan Police H Division walking their grim beat. The sound triggers a primal, shivering dread that burrows straight through the inadequate insulation of your thin wool blanket. The officers represent the direct, physical threat of being dragged back to the soaring brick walls of the poorhouse. The memory of the silent dining halls and the watery gruel rushes back, suffocating you with the terrifying weight of strict institutional control. You hold your breath until the heavy footfalls fade into the swirling yellow smog, the silence rushing back to fill the void. The freedom to starve in these freezing slums feels infinitely preferable to the calculated, systematic destruction of your identity behind locked iron gates. A ragged, tearing cough erupts from the darkness just 3 beds to your left, shattering the tense quiet of the dormitory. The sound is wet and heavy, the unmistakable signature of advanced consumption ravaging the delicate tissue of the lungs. The afflicted man gasps for air with a desperate, whistling wheeze, his chest heaving hard against the rusted springs of his cot. You pull your collar over your mouth and nose, a futile attempt to filter the microscopic threats hovering in the stagnant air. The disease moves through these crowded tenements like an invisible scythe, harvesting the weakened and the malnourished without prejudice or pause. The terrifying arithmetic of the slums dictates that 1 in 7 residents will ultimately succumb to the wasting sickness. You count the seconds between his desperate inhalations, the agonizing rhythm serving as a grim testament to the fragility of human endurance. The sharp medicinal tang of alcohol and opium cuts through the pervasive odor of unwashed bodies. A mother in the far corner has unstoppered a small glass vial of Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne, seeking relief for her feverish, whimpering infant. The cheap patent medicine is a staple of the desperate, offering a dangerous narcotic calm in place of genuine healing. You hear the soft clink of glass against a tin spoon, followed by the enforced silence of the heavily dosed child. The laudanum mixture spreads a deceptive peace over the localized area, masking the underlying illness with a thick chemical fog. The reliance on such toxic remedies highlights the failure of the medical establishment to address the fundamental realities of poverty. The sweet, cloying smell lingers in the drafty room, a ghostly reminder of the constant, invisible battle for survival. You shift your weight onto your right side, the coarse straw of the flock mattress poking sharply through the threadbare ticking. The iron bed frame protests with a loud metallic shriek, a sound mirrored by the settling timber joints of the decaying structure. The lodging house groans under the crushing density of its desperate occupants, the plaster cracking and peeling like diseased skin. You trace a jagged fissure in the wall beside your head, feeling the cold, damp draft leaking steadily through the damaged masonry. The architecture of the rookery offers no genuine sanctuary, functioning merely as a fragile, porous barrier against the lethal elements. The structural integrity of the building mirrors the physical state of the people trapped inside, pushed far beyond safe limits and teetering on the edge of total collapse. The cold seeps from the exposed brick directly into your aching shoulder joint. A sudden fierce cramp twists through your empty stomach, a vicious rebellion against the adulterated food consumed hours ago. The The cheap street bread, heavily laced with corrosive alum to appear white, burns its way through your digestive tract with a fierce acidity. You double over, pressing your forearms hard against your abdomen to counteract the rolling waves of nausea. The vendors who peddle such poison sustenance operate with total impunity, exploiting the sheer desperation of the starving workforce. Your body struggles to extract any usable energy from the toxic mass, prioritizing basic organ function over the healing of torn muscle and blistered skin. The hunger is not merely an absence of food, but an active, relentless force tearing at your internal reserves. You swallow hard against the rising bile, the bitter taste of chicory coffee making an unwelcome return. The distant, mournful chime of a church clock strikes 4 heavy, vibrating notes across the sleeping district. Time distorts and stretches in the lightless void of the dormitory, turning minutes into hours of agonizing reflection. The deep night strips away the frantic distractions of the workday, leaving you alone with the terrifying scale of your own destitution. You stare up at the invisible ceiling, charting the impossible mathematics required to survive the coming winter without a steady dockyard tally. The fear is a cold, heavy stone sitting squarely in the center of your chest, restricting the flow of oxygen to your panicked brain. You force your mind to focus on the immediate, tangible reality of the rough blanket and the hard iron frame. Projecting too far into the bleak future is a guaranteed method for losing your fragile grip on sanity. The sudden, sharp shatter of breaking glass from the street below jerks your nervous system into high alert. A loud, slurred argument erupts in the narrow alleyway. The voice is thick with cheap gin and misplaced aggression. You listen to the heavy thud of a body striking the brick pavement, followed immediately by the rapid, scuffling retreat of leather boots. The casual violence of Whitechapel operates outside the boundaries of the law, a brutal, self-policing ecosystem ruled by desperation and physical strength. Nobody in the dormitory moves or makes a sound, adhering strictly to the unwritten code of strict non-interference. Getting involved in the chaotic disputes of the detonite guarantees severe injury and unwanted attention from the authorities. You let the tension slowly drain from your locked muscles as the alleyway returns to its menacing, secretive silence. You recall the intense, rain-soaked political meeting you witnessed weeks ago, the passionate speaker demanding basic human dignity for the laboring class. The memory feels disconnected from the present reality of the freezing, vermin-infested lodging house. The grand concepts of social reform and union organization shatter against the immediate, crushing necessity of securing the next fourpence. You wonder briefly if the matchgirls who struck for better conditions ever felt this isolating terror in the darkest hours before dawn. The desire for systemic change requires a surplus of energy that simply does not exist in a body starved of calories and rest. The revolutionary spirit is effectively suffocated by the daily, grinding exhaustion of the sweatshop and the docks. You wipe a line of cold sweat from your forehead, the idealistic thoughts fading back into the grim mechanics of survival. The scratching of vermin within the walls intensifies, a frantic scrabbling sound that sets your already frayed nerves on edge. The rats move with impunity through the decaying infrastructure of the tenement, unbothered by the human misery surrounding them. You watch a large, dark shape dart across the floorboards near the door, its long tail dragging through the accumulated dust and debris. The presence of the scavengers is a constant, degrading reminder of the specific ecological niche you occupy within the capital. The line separating the destitute workers from the vermin feels perilously thin during these isolated, lightless hours. You pull your boots tighter against your chest beneath the blanket, ensuring the leather is protected from sharp, hungry teeth. The battle for resources extends far beyond the hiring queues, encompassing every square inch of the rookery. The heavy, sulphurous fog pressing against the window pane seems to glow with a faint, sickly luminescence from the distant street lamps. You trace the intricate patterns of condensation forming on the inside of the glass, the water droplets streaking through the thick layers of industrial soot. The view outside is thoroughly obscured, reducing the vast, sprawling metropolis to a claustrophobic box of gray vapor. The isolation of the slum is magnified by the weather, trapping the residents in a localized bubble of toxic air and freezing damp. You press your palm against the freezing plaster of the wall, feeling the structural chill radiating from the very bones of the building. The architecture itself feels actively hostile, a poorly constructed trap designed to extract rent while offering nothing in the way of genuine shelter. The economics of the East End are carved directly into the crumbling masonry. The rhythmic dripping from the ceiling leak has formed a small, freezing puddle near the foot of your iron bedstead. You watch the dark water spread slowly across the uneven floorboards, a creeping tide of discomfort that threatens your meager belongings. The lack of maintenance in these buildings is staggering, reflecting the unchecked power the absentee landlords hold over their captive tenants. Complaining about the conditions guarantees immediate eviction, a swift transition from a damp mattress to the lethal exposure of the open street. The system enforces silence through the constant looming threat of destitution. You carefully shift your position to avoid the spreading moisture, pulling your knees even tighter against your hollow chest. The small constant indignities of poverty grind down your resolve far more effectively than any singular disaster. The temperature inside the crowded room drops precipitously as the pre-dawn hours assert their rigid dominance. The collective body heat of the 50 sleeping men is no longer sufficient to combat the freezing draft pouring through the broken window pane. You pull the rough wool blanket over your head, creating a tiny, suffocating pocket of recycled breath. The air inside your makeshift tent is stale and laden with the scent of your own unwashed skin, but it offers a crucial barrier against the biting chill. The dampness in your trousers has finally dried, leaving the coarse fabric stiff and caked with the abrasive dirt of the coal cellar. You flex your toes inside your boots, the leather remaining rigid and punishing against your blistered heels. The physical discomfort demands constant, agonizing adjustments just to maintain a baseline level of tolerable misery. A faint, barely perceptible shift occurs in the impenetrable darkness pressing against the filthy glass of the window. The pitch black of the deep night begins to dilute into a bruised, sullen charcoal, signaling the agonizingly slow approach of the morning. You pull the blanket down past your eyes, watching the dust motes become faintly visible in the shifting gloom. The visual confirmation of the coming day brings no relief, only the grim realization that the cycle of crushing labor is about to reset. The brief sanctuary of the night has been spent in a state of tense, shivering vigilance, offering no genuine restoration to your battered frame. You listen to the breathing of the men around you shift from the deep rhythm of sleep to the shallow, restless stirring of impending wakefulness. The city is preparing to demand its daily sacrifice of human energy. You slide your hand carefully beneath the prickly straw mattress, your fingers brushing the cold, reassuring edge of your remaining copper coin. The single penny represents your entire capacity to secure a piece of alum bread and a cup of watered coffee before facing the dock foreman. You trace the worn profile of the monarch stamped into the metal, a tiny piece of the sprawling empire hidden in the squalor of the East End. The physical reality of the coin grounds you, pulling your focus away from the overwhelming dread of the impending dawn. You begin the slow, agonizing process of uncurling your stiff, frozen limbs, preparing your body to endure the vertical transition. The rusted springs shriek loudly as you shift your weight, the sound cutting sharply through the quiet anticipation of the dormitory. The time for waiting has definitively ended. You push yourself upright, the sudden movement causing a wave of dizziness to wash over your malnourished brain. The freezing air hits your face and neck, raising coarse goose flesh along your exposed skin. You swing your legs over the edge of the iron frame, your heavy boots landing softly on the warped, splintering floorboards. The man in the adjacent cot sits up with a harsh groan, his face a pale mask of exhaustion in the weak, filtering light. The silent communion of the waking laborers requires no greeting, only the shared understanding of the brutal trial ahead. You stand up, your knees popping loudly in the cold, damp air, your spine rigid with accumulated tension. The march back to the treacherous, mud-slicked gates of the river docks begins now. The journey through the pre-dawn gloom requires navigating a shifting landscape of impenetrable shadows and localized hazards. You bypass the main thoroughfare in favor of a narrower alley, your boots slipping occasionally on the slick, frost-coated cobblestones. The oppressive silhouette of the district mortuary emerges from the mist, its soot-stained brickwork absorbing the meager light from a distant street lamp. A sharp chemical mixture of carbolic powder and unslaked lime aggressively assaults your olfactory senses, overpowering the ambient scent of the river. Someone has scratched their initials deep into the heavy wooden doorframe, a tiny, desperate rebellion against the crushing anonymity of the slums. The building serves as the final, inescapable destination for those who lose the daily battle against the elements and the economy. You stare at the darkened windows, Acutely aware of the silent, frozen occupants lying on the stone slabs inside, the grim mathematics of mortality govern every aspect of existence in these crowded, decaying streets. Physicians compile extensive ledgers detailing the relentless spread of tuberculosis, a disease that claims 1 out of every 7 residents with terrifying efficiency. The affliction announces itself with a hollow, persistent hack, slowly dissolving the lungs while the victim wastes away in a cold, damp room. Infant survival rates present an even bleaker calculus, with nearly half of all children perishing before reaching their 5th year. You catch yourself automatically subtracting figures when observing large families, a morbid habit born of constant exposure to localized tragedy. The air you breathe carries the microscopic agents of typhus and diphtheria, invisible executioners waiting for a moment of constitutional weakness. Survival is not a guarantee, but a temporary reprieve negotiated daily through sheer physical endurance. The pervasive fear of the unmarked pauper's pit drives the poorest laborers to part with their vital, hard-earned coppers. Burial clubs flourish in every neighborhood, collecting weekly halfpennies to ensure a dignified, recognized departure from the physical world. The ultimate insult of the Victorian era is to be discarded into a mass grave, erased from the earth without a designated stone to mark your passage. You recall witnessing a meager funeral procession just days ago, the attendees wearing faded black armbands purchased at immense personal cost. The display of grief is rigidly structured and highly visible, a public declaration that the deceased possessed inherent value despite their absolute destitution. The cost of this final dignity often requires surviving relatives to forego necessary sustenance for weeks. The economy of death operates with the same ruthless efficiency as the sweatshops in the docks. You alter your course away from the riverfront, drawn by a sudden, irrational impulse to inspect the boundaries of your confinement. Walking westward through the hushed city reveals the gradual, calculated transition from industrial squalor to accumulated wealth. The jagged, broken pavement slowly smooths into precisely laid stone blocks, offering the secure, even footing that feels luxurious beneath your worn boots. The dense, suffocating smog begins to thin, replaced by an atmosphere that feels remarkably clean and unburdened by toxic particulate matter. The architecture evolves from crumbling, overcrowded tenements to imposing, solid structures designed for permanence and comfort. The gradient of inequality is mapped directly onto the geography of the capital, a physical manifestation of the rigid class divisions. You push further into the affluent territory, an unwelcome intruder wandering through a landscape of exclusive privilege. The avenues of Mayfair and Piccadilly present a stark, jarring contrast to the desperate alleys of your own neighborhood. Elaborate gaslights line the broad streets at regular intervals, casting brilliant, overlapping pools of illumination that banish the shadows. The silence here carries a distinct quality of expensive serenity, vastly different from the tense, predatory quiet of the rookeries. Intricate wrought iron fences protect manicured gardens, while heavy oak doors gleam with thick layers of pristine varnish and polished brass hardware. You observe the massive plate glass windows displaying exotic goods and superfluous luxuries, items that cost more than a docker could earn in a decade. The sheer volume of surplus wealth concentrated in these few square miles is staggering, representing the apex of the global imperial machine. You walk past the grand facades, your presence tolerated only because the wealthy occupants remain securely unconscious behind heavy velvet curtains. The realization of the immense economic disparity settles over you, a heavy, suffocating weight that rivals the physical exhaustion in your limbs. The top fraction of the population controls the vast majority of the empire's resources, dictating the harsh terms of survival for the millions toiling below. The systems generating this staggering prosperity rely on the disposable bodies of the men and women currently freezing in the eastern slums. You trace the ornate carving on a stone pillar, wondering how many lives were shortened to finance this single piece of decorative masonry. The anger that flares in your chest is a cold, rational fury, born of first-hand experience with the brutal mechanics of exploitation. The illusion of inevitable poverty shatters against the undeniable physical evidence of abundant, hoarded wealth. The society that normalizes such profound inequality requires a vast, coordinated effort of deliberate blindness. You recall a discarded pamphlet detailing the passionate efforts of the local animal welfare societies, their well-funded campaigns dedicated to the ethical treatment of carriage horses. The The organized compassion of the middle classes flows generously toward equines, while remaining steadfastly oblivious to the starving children sweeping the nearby crossings. The paradox is a masterpiece of selective morality, allowing the affluent to feel virtuous while participating in a system of rampant human exploitation. A perfectly groomed horse rests in a heated stable just yards from where you stand, enjoying a level of security and comfort denied to the majority of the working poor. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this dual standard is woven tightly into the cultural fabric of the era. You shake your head, the bitter irony leaving a sour metallic taste on your tongue. The empire protects its beasts of burden far better than its human engines of commerce. The necessity of securing the day's wages forces you to abandon the pristine avenues and turn back toward the industrial east. The transition happens in reverse, the brilliant gaslights spacing out and fading as the architecture degrades into familiar, soot-stained brickwork. The air thickens with every step eastward. The harsh, sulfurous bite returning to coat the back of your throat. You feel the crushing weight of the slums reasserting its hold, pulling you back into the localized reality of endless struggle and minimal reward. The brief excursion into the affluent zone provides no comfort, serving only to highlight the artificial, constructed nature of your own destitution. The invisible borders separating the classes are enforced by economics rather than masonry, yet they remain as impenetrable as any physical fortress. You lower your head and increase your pace, eager to merge back into the anonymous, suffering crowd. The route toward the docks takes you past a modest utilitarian building bearing the stark signage of the Salvation Army. The structure stands as a rare outpost of proactive intervention in a district largely abandoned by the traditional religious establishment. You remember attending a crowded, rain-soaked meeting in their hall, drawn by the simple promise of hot tea and a dry bench. The soldiers in their crisp uniforms operate with a martial efficiency, venturing into the most dangerous courts to offer practical assistance rather than mere theological judgment. The music of their brass bands occasionally cuts through the ambient misery of the streets, providing a jarring, unexpected note of defiant optimism. The charity they provide is a crucial lifeline for the absolute poorest, yet it functions within the very system that guarantees the continuous generation of poverty. You acknowledge the vital necessity of their work, while recognizing its fundamental inability to alter the underlying economic machinery. A narrow side street reveals the dilapidated exterior of a local ragged school, a philanthropic endeavor attempting to educate the most destitute youth. The institution operates on meager donations, battling impossible odds to provide basic literacy to children who spend their days scavenging in the mud. The truancy officers mandated by the recent educational acts struggle to enforce attendance, their efforts thwarted by the sheer necessity of child labor. A family teetering on the edge of starvation cannot afford to lose the meager pennies generated by a 7-year-old crossing sweeper. The promise of education rings hollow when the immediate alternative is dying of exposure in a freezing alleyway. You stare at the dark windows of the schoolroom, contemplating the millions of bright, capable minds systematically crushed by the demands of the industrial age. The systemic denial of opportunity ensures the perpetual replication of the underclass. The reality of child labor in the district encompasses tasks that defy modern comprehension in their degrading, hazardous nature. You have seen the young pure finders roaming the gutters with their battered wooden buckets, hunting for dog excrement to sell to the local tanneries. The caustic materials used in the leatherworking process require this specific, foul ingredient, creating a bizarre microeconomy based on the collection of filth. These children spend their formative years handling toxic waste, their small hands permanently stained and their lungs compromised by the noxious fumes. The exploitation of youth is not a hidden, shameful secret, but a highly visible, normalized component of the urban landscape. The capitalist machine identifies value in the most repulsive substances, employing the most vulnerable citizens to extract it. The sheer horror of the practice is diluted only by its overwhelming frequency. The female workforce of the capital endures a parallel track of exploitation, hidden behind the respectable facades of middle-class domesticity. A massive, invisible army of scullery maids and charwomen rises long before dawn, laboring in the damp, freezing basements of affluent homes. Their duties involve hauling heavy scuttles of coal, scrubbing stone floors with caustic lye and maintaining the flawless illusion of effortless prosperity for their employers. The wages are pitifully small, often consisting primarily of basic room and board in a lightless cupboard beneath the stairs. The vulnerability of these women is absolute, their continued employment dependent upon the arbitrary whims and moral character of the household master. The societal structure demands their constant grueling exertion, while simultaneously rendering them socially invisible. You think of the countless women currently breaking the ice in washing tubs across the city, their hands raw and bleeding in the dark. Within the crumbling tenements, small acts of defiance occasionally bloom against the crushing weight of the sweatshop economy. You have heard rumors of seamstresses pooling their meager piecework earnings to secure a shared room, creating an unofficial cooperative outside the control of the abusive foreman. These fragile alliances offer a vital buffer against immediate destitution, allowing the women to share the cost of a single charcoal fire and a loaf of bread. The communal strategy represents a profound threat to the isolated, competitive nature of the sweated labor system. The bonds formed in these cramped, freezing quarters are forged through intense shared suffering and mutual reliance. The tiny rebellions require immense courage, carrying the constant risk of blacklisting and retaliatory eviction. The human impulse towards solidarity persists, even in the most hostile, resource-starved environments imaginable. The unmistakable briny scent of the Thames grows stronger as you approach the perimeter of the sprawling docklands. The massive skeletal frames of the iron cranes loom out of the fog like ancient, silent sentinels, guarding the edge of the empire. The scale of the port is staggering, an endless labyrinth of brick warehouses, deep water basins, and miles of specialized wharves. The river itself is an opaque churning force, carrying the combined effluent of the metropolis out toward the distant sea. You hear the deep, resonant blast of a steamship horn cutting through the mist, announcing the arrival of another cargo vessel laden with global plunder. The infrastructure required to process this unimaginable volume of trade dictates the entire physical layout of the East End. You quicken your pace, the magnetic pull of the hiring gates asserting its familiar dominance over your movements. The workforce gathered near the river represents a diverse, exploited cross-section of the entire maritime world. You pass a huddled group of Lascar sailors from the Indian subcontinent, their thin, inadequate clothing offering zero protection against the biting London frost. The shipping companies utilize these foreign crews to aggressively depress wages, housing them in squalid, unregulated boarding houses between voyages. The hierarchy of exploitation pits desperate men against one another, utilizing xenophobia and language barriers to prevent any unified resistance. The shared misery of the frozen docks transcends national origins, binding the laborers together in a brutal fraternity of exhausted muscle and empty stomachs. You exchange a brief wordless nod with a tall Scandinavian stevedore, the universal gesture of men preparing for the imminent physical ordeal. The machinery of global commerce grinds down all variations of humanity into a single uniform paste. Whispered conversations among the gathered men frequently circle around the dangerous, electrifying concept of organized collective action. The name of Ben Tillett circulates through the crowd like a hidden current, a union organizer daring to articulate the simmering rage of the casual laborer. The unprecedented success of the Match Girl strike has ignited a fragile, highly volatile spark of hope among the previously fractured dockworkers. The idea of a coordinated work stoppage, a massive refusal to unload the precious cargo, is discussed in hushed, reverent tones. The logistical challenge of uniting thousands of disparate, starving men seems insurmountable, yet the desperation has reached a critical, explosive threshold. The potential power of a united workforce represents the single greatest threat to the established economic order. You listen to the intense debates, feeling the tectonic plates of the social structure groaning under the mounting pressure. The terrifying risk associated with such rebellion keeps the vast majority of the men hesitant and fearful. Participating in an organized strike guarantees immediate termination and placement on the regional blacklist, a sentence of slow starvation for both the worker and his dependents. The foremen utilize a vast network of informers to identify and eliminate any perceived agitators before their ideas can take root. The precarious balance between necessary obedience and righteous anger defines the psychological landscape of the staging area. You weigh the theoretical promise of fair wages against the absolute certainty of the empty belly. a calculation that has broken countless revolutionary spirits. The courage required to sacrifice today's copper for tomorrow's justice is a rare and costly commodity. The tension in the pre-dawn air crackles with the unspoken anticipation of an impending, massive collision. The staging area outside the main iron gates is a sprawling, chaotic sea of patched wool coats and battered flat caps. Thousands of men stand shoulder to shoulder in the freezing gloom, their collective body heat creating a localized microclimate of rising steam. The sheer volume of human exhalations forms a dense, unified cloud, hovering just above the crowd, a visible manifestation of their shared existence. You wedge yourself into a narrow gap between two massive, broad-shouldered coal whippers, securing a physical anchor in the shifting, restless tide of bodies. The ambient noise is a low, continuous murmur of suppressed coughs, stamping boots, and muttered complaints. The anticipation of the call-on tightens the muscles in your jaw, sending a surge of necessary adrenaline through your fatigue system. The brutal competition for survival is about to commence, requiring absolute physical and mental readiness. The flickering light from a nearby naphtha flare illuminates the severe physical toll etched into the faces surrounding you. The brutal, unforgiving nature of the dockwork accelerates the aging process, transforming men in their 30s into broken, stooped figures. You observe a myriad of occupational scars, missing digits, crushed hands, and deep, puckered lacerations, earned through violent contact with heavy machinery. The men display these disfigurements without shame, treating them as the true, unforgeable currency of the East End labor market. The physical damage serves as an undeniable testament to their endurance and their continued utility to the foreman. Your own hands ache in sympathetic resonance. The blisters and callus form a tough protective armor over your damaged skin. The body adapts to the relentless trauma by becoming a hardened, desensitized instrument of pure labor. The supreme mental fortitude required to endure this daily ritual is forged in the deepest fires of absolute necessity. You banish all thoughts of the comfortable, heated mansions of Mayfair, focusing your entire consciousness on the heavy iron gates looming in the mist. The coming hours will demand the systematic destruction of your own muscle tissue in exchange for a few stamped metal tokens. The ability to accept this brutal transaction without surrendering to despair is the defining characteristic of the successful casual laborer. You square your shoulders and adjust your stance on the slippery cobblestones, planting your boots firmly against the inevitable surge of the crowd. The warning bell tolls a single harsh note across the wharves, silencing the murmurs and crystallizing the tension. The lock turns with a heavy metallic clank, and the machinery of the docks grinds into motion once more. You surge forward as the heavy iron gates part, carried by the crushing momentum of 1,000 desperate men. The foreman points his thick finger, selecting bodies based on a brutal, instantaneous calculation of muscle and necessity. Your hand shoots up, a silent plea backed by the raw demand of survival in these unforgiving streets. His gaze sweeps over you, pausing for a fraction of a second before he nods curtly in your direction. The relief is immediate and physically overwhelming, a sharp exhalation that momentarily clears the freezing fog from your lungs. You push through the iron turnstile, leaving the unlucky majority behind to face another day of agonizing hunger. The brass tally pressed into your palm feels like the heaviest, most valuable object in the British Empire. The assigned task involves transferring massive crates of imported tea from a towering clipper ship to the cavernous brick warehouse. The scent of dried leaves and exotic spices mocks the pervasive odor of the Thames sludge clinging to the wooden pilings. You brace your legs as the wooden crate is lowered onto your shoulders, the sharp edges biting through your thin canvas coat. Every step up the slick wooden ramp requires a monumental effort of concentrated willpower and burning muscle tissue. The Norwegian sailors above shout rapid commands, their voices swallowed by the deafening clatter of chains and steam winches. You focus solely on the treacherous, splintered planks beneath your boots, ignoring the agonizing strain radiating down your spine. The machinery of global trade relies without exception on this localized destruction of your physical form. Hours bleed together into a monotonous, grinding cycle of lifting, hauling, and returning to the ship's massive hold. The bruised gray light of the morning slowly transforms into the flat, unyielding glare of a London afternoon. You lose all sense of individual identity, becoming nothing more than a functional, biological cog in the vast port infrastructure. The skin on your palms tears and bleeds, the blood mixing with the abrasive grit of the docks to form a dark, hardened paste. A man working the line beside you stumbles, his heavy load crashing onto the wet stones with a terrifying, splintering crack. The foreman screams a stream of vicious curses, instantly docking the man's pay for the damaged merchandise. You keep your head down and maintain your grueling pace, terrified of drawing any similar destructive attention to your own fatigue. The harsh metallic clang of the evening bell finally shatters the relentless rhythm of the exhausted labor force. You drop your last crate with trembling arms, your muscles twitching uncontrollably from the sustained, brutal exertion. The queue for payment forms quickly. A silent, jagged line of broken men waiting outside the clerk's small brick office. Gas lamps sputter to life along the perimeter of the yard, casting long, distorted shadows across the muddy ground. You hand over your brass tally and receive 4 copper coins, the precise calculated value of your day's existence. The metal is cold and hard against your raw flesh, a tangible representation of another 24 hours of guaranteed survival. You join the mass exodus flowing out through the main gates, turning your back on the river and the towering cranes. The transition from the structured brutality of the wharves to the chaotic peril of Whitechapel requires an immediate shift in vigilance. The fog has returned with the setting sun, rolling off the Thames in thick, suffocating waves of sulphurous yellow mist. You navigate the labyrinthine alleys with extreme caution, avoiding the darkest corners where the city's nocturnal predators wait. A street vendor offers roasted chestnuts from a glowing brazier, the sweet, smoky aroma cutting sharply through the ambient stench. You surrender one of your precious coppers for a small paper cone, letting the heat of the roasted nuts thaw your frozen fingers. The meager meal provides a tiny, localized burst of energy, barely enough to fuel the remaining march back to Dorset Street. The brick walls of the tenement seem to lean inward, trapping the smog and the misery in a claustrophobic embrace. You cross the intersection of Commercial Street, the chaotic flow of heavy omnibuses and erratic hansom cabs demanding strict, focused attention. The naphtha flares of the costermongers hiss and spit in the damp air, illuminating the fierce haggling over bruised produce. A group of Salvation Army soldiers marches past, their brass instruments gleaming incongruously against the backdrop of unyielding squalor. Their music is a discordant, defiant blast of hope that briefly drowns out the pervasive, grinding noise of the slums. You watch them disappear into the mist, their crisp uniforms swallowed by the relentless consuming gray of the evening. The energy of the street is frantic and defensive, every individual hyper-aware of the ever-present threats hiding in the gloom. You tighten your grip on the remaining coins in your pocket, pushing forward toward the promise of a rented bed. The courtyard of the rookery is a landscape of shadowed doorways and overflowing gutters, stinking of lime and decay. You step over a discarded pile of rotting vegetables, the slick refuse threatening to twist your ankle in the dark. A woman argues fiercely with a staggering man near the communal water pump, their voices echoing harshly against the surrounding brick. You ignore the dispute, keeping your eyes locked on the battered wooden door of your designated lodging house. Survival in these dense enclosures depends on maintaining strict boundaries and refusing to engage with the surrounding chaos. The fog swirls in the enclosed space, trapping the various odors of poverty into a dense, inescapable miasma. You reach the entrance and push your shoulder against the heavy oak, forcing the warped door open against its rusted hinges. The common kitchen is packed with exhausted laborers fighting for space near the banked coals of the massive central hearth. The smell is an overpowering combination of boiling cabbage, wet wool, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap gin. You bypass the crowded room, offering your payment to the deputy keeper sitting behind his secure wire mesh cage. He slides a numbered wooden token across the scarred counter, his eyes hollow and devoid of any human recognition. The transaction is swift and sterile, reducing your existence to a simple localized data point in his filthy ledger. You secure the token in your pocket, turning toward the narrow, pitch-black stairwell leading to the upper dormitories. The heat from the kitchen begins to fade the moment you step onto the first creaking wooden tread. You grip the greasy wooden banister and begin the agonizing ascent, your knees popping with every upward step. The shadows in the stairwell are dense, requiring you to navigate the treacherous, uneven boards solely by touch and memory. The ambient noise of the building is a collective, overlapping groan of settling timber and exhausted, hacking lungs. You reach the third-floor landing, the air growing noticeably hotter and staler with the accumulated body heat of 50 unwashed men. The hallway smells of carbolic acid and despair, a potent olfactory reminder of the squalid reality of your confinement. You locate the heavy door of your assigned room, pushing it open to reveal the chaotic landscape of rusted iron bedsteads. The dormitory is a holding pen for the broken, a place where the city deposits its utilized human machinery for the night. You locate your numbered cot in the far corner, the thin, lumpy flock mattress representing your ultimate, desperately desired goal. You sit down heavily on the edge of the frame, the rusted spring shrieking in loud, metallic protest under your weight. Your hands tremble uncontrollably as you untie your boots, the stiff, mud-caked leather resisting your clumsy, exhausted efforts. The physical relief of freeing your swollen feet is immediate and intense, a sharp spike of pleasure amidst the overwhelming ache. You carefully tuck the boots beneath the mattress, ensuring they remain secure from the opportunistic thieves roaming the dark room. The cold from the warped floorboards seeps instantly through your damp socks, urging you to seek the meager insulation of the bed. You lie back against the coarse ticking, the physical collapse of your body finally complete and irreversible. The narrative pace slows as the frantic energy of the day dissolves into the stagnant atmosphere of the crowded dormitory. The relentless noise of Whitechapel fades to a distant, muffled rumble, the city's massive engine idling in the deep night. You focus your attention away from the throbbing pain in your muscles, directing your mind toward the tiny details of your immediate environment. The shift in perspective is a necessary survival mechanism, preventing the crushing weight of tomorrow from paralyzing your thoughts. The room is a tapestry of shadows and faint, ambient light, devoid of any sudden movements or alarming sounds. The collective breathing of the sleeping men forms a slow, rhythmic ocean of sound, a surprisingly calming counterpoint to the day's chaos. The transition from active endurance to passive rest requires a complete surrender of control. The specific scent of old, burned tallow lingers heavily in the air. Drifting from a recently extinguished candle in the corridor, you listen to the exact brittle sound of a single piece of dried straw snapping under the weight of your shifting shoulder. The coarse wool of the blanket presses down with a distinct, rough friction against the exposed skin of your chin. A slow, deep groan of contracting timber echoes from the roof joists, settling into the freezing temperature of the night. The faint, metallic rattle of a loose window pane vibrates in time with a sudden, sharp gust of wind outside. You feel the precise, icy draft tracing a thin, invisible line across the raw knuckles of your right hand. The texture of the flock mattress feels like packed earth beneath the bruised, aching line of your spine. A tiny, localized patch of frost begins to scrape and form along the inside edge of the cracked glass. The smell of damp plaster dust settles into the back of your throat with every slow, measured inhalation. The faint, rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch sounds from the coat of a man sleeping 3 beds away. The heavy, dark warmth of the enclosed room presses against your closed eyelids like a physical, comforting weight. You notice the subtle shift in the air pressure as the distant fog rolls thicker against the brick facade. The last remaining sound is the steady, quiet exhalation of your own breath into the still air. You close your eyes. Rest now, for these forgotten streets will hold their silence until you are ready to walk them again.